Welcome to Section 1 of Mastering Magento. In this first video, we'll be preparing your server, so let's get started. Before we begin, make sure you have a Linux server with root access. I'll be using a virtual machine with Ubuntu 12.04 installed. Make sure we have internet access on that machine so that you can download and install software from the Ubuntu repositories. And we're also going to be editing a lot of files through the terminal, so make sure your command line skills are up to par. Lastly, get your hands on the code samples for Section 1, since in there you can find the example web server configuration we'll be using in this video. The software that we'll be installing in this video differs slightly from a typical LAMP stack. I'll be showing you how to run Magento on an Nginx web server with MySQL and PHP FPM as the backend. The reason for doing this is because a lot of Magento optimization techniques involve supplanting Apache with Nginx. So seeing this in a video tutorial will be helpful to any of you who are experimenting with Magento optimization. First step is to fire up our terminal and install the Nginx web server. Our command is sudo apt-get install nginx. Say yes when prompted to install dependencies. Next, we're going to install MySQL. Our command is sudo apt-get install mysql-server. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and install MySQL Workbench. MySQL Workbench is a GUI tool that we can use to configure our MySQL server. Again, say yes when prompted to install any dependencies. During the MySQL installation process, we're going to be prompted for a root password. You can make this whatever you would like. Eventually, we'll be creating a separate user for just the Magento database. Once MySQL is finished installing, we're going to install PHP. So type sudo apt-get install php 5-fpm. PHP FPM is the fast CGI process manager. We're also going to need to install a variety of modules required by Magento. Again, say yes when prompted to install dependencies. With our software installed, we can clear our terminal and prepare to configure our web server. We're going to be creating a new virtual host, so let's create the file etc nginx sites available Magento. I've created this file from the sample code for Section 1. You can see that we're setting up a basic virtual host with a new document root and a new server name. The Magento specific items are pretty much just this location block, which is saying try an existing file or folder and then pass things off to a handler, and the handler rewrites everything to index.php. Nginx is going to use PHP FPM to process any PHP scripts, so we're using the out-of-the-box fast CGI handler, which is listening on port 9000 by default. So we haven't had to mess with our PHP FPM configuration, which should be fine for the remaining videos in this series. So with our virtual host configuration saved, we now need to enable it. We do so by symlinking the etc nginx sites available Magento file into the etc nginx sites enabled folder. So what we'll see in that sites enabled folder is now two virtual hosts. The default virtual host for Nginx, which we can ignore, and our new Magento virtual host. So let's restart our Nginx service. And before we test this in the browser, we want to add to our etc hosts file the virtual host name and map it to our local host IP address. So make sure you do that and save it. And we also want to create just a sample index file to test this in the browser. So make sure first you make the var www Magento folders, and then we can edit the index.php file in there. And I'm simply outputting the PHP info page. Okay, we can clear our terminal, and let's test this in the browser. We're going to go ahead and load magento.local, and it looks good. So let's recap. We started out by installing our server software. Once we had Nginx, MySQL, and PHP set up, we configured our Nginx virtual host in the Sites Available folder and symlinked it to the Sites Enabled folder. Don't forget to make sure that your etc hosts file is updated, and also don't forget to create a sample index.php file that you can use to test your server in the browser. Coming up next, we're going to proceed with installing the Magento software, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Mastering Magento. In the last video, you followed along as we set up the basic software packages needed for running your Magento store. In this video, we will step through the installation wizard. Let's get started. First off, we need to get our hands on the Magento source code. The Magento website gives us two options. We can either download the Community Edition directly, or check out the source code from an SVN repository. I usually recommend using SVN, especially if you're familiar with it, because I've found that in my experience it's helped upgrades run more smoothly. So to check out the code, Magento actually gives us an example command, so we can just copy that and paste it into our terminal. So first we'll want to change into the directory where we set our virtual host's document root. In the previous video, that was var www Magento. And you can see that in between now and then I changed the owner of the folder to my own Magento user, so I don't have to use sudo in this case. The last important thing to remember is that when you're checking out a branch like this, we need to specify the destination folder as dot, meaning the current folder. Otherwise, it's going to check it out into a separate 1.7 folder in the current directory. So this should work. And actually, the SVN checkout usually takes a while, so we're going to fast forward to the next bit of this video. Now that our SVN checkout is completed, I can clear my terminal and get ready to set up our database for Magento. We're going to log into our MySQL server with the root user and password that we configured when setting up the server in the previous video. Once logged in, we'll want to first create a database for Magento to use. And then we're going to want to create a new user. So the user I'm creating only has access to the Magento database and is using a very simple password, just the word Magento. Lastly, in MySQL, especially in command line, we want to flush the privileges. That way our user account exists and is accessible to any MySQL clients. Okay, so we can exit MySQL, and let's clear our terminal, and we should be ready to follow the installation wizard now. The first time you visit your Magento server in the browser, it will take you through the installation wizard. So let's go to magento.local now and see what happens. So the installation wizard is pretty straightforward. Once you proceed through the software license, terms and conditions, you'll be taken to the first of many screens where Magento will collect the pertinent information for your installation. On this first screen, you want to make sure that you select the proper time zone. This is very important because Magento stores all database timestamps in GMT. So the first of many errors you may see when proceeding through the Magento installation is the file system permissions error that you see here. This is telling us that certain paths in the Magento folder structure need to be writable. So in order to fix this, let's jump to our terminal and make sure that app, etc, var, and media are writable by the web server. So the permissions currently on the app Etsy folder, for instance, are owned by me, the Magento user account, and only group writable. So what I want to do is sudo change the owner of that folder and all of its contents, so I'm specifying recursive, to the web server user, which on my server is www-data. And once I do that on app Etsy, you can see now the config XMLs in that module folder are owned by www-data. So I'm going to do the same for my bar, and what was the other folder? It was media. Okay. All right, so media is good and var looks good. So let's see if this error goes away. Okay, that's better. We're getting a different error now. And you can see that these are some of the extensions we installed in the last video. So what I want to show you here is that one of the paradigm shifts using PHP FPM is that you now have a process for PHP you need to restart. Since we now have a PHP service, we have to sudo service PHP FPM restart. So this is going to reload our PHP configuration, hence now loading these newly installed extensions. All right, so let's see if that goes away. Great. All right, so the configuration screen is basically asking us for all the credentials for connecting to the MySQL server. So we just set up that user. Username is Magento, password is Magento, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to leave the table prefix blank. For the web access options, we want our base URL to always have some sort of top-level domain. In the previous video, we set up our virtual host to use magento.local, and I did that on purpose. I didn't use Magento only because if there is no top-level domain, Magento has issues with cookies. So if you're using a single word for your base URL and having troubles logging in, that would be why. Make sure you use something with a .domain. Admin path is something you can customize. By default, it's admin, but you can make it anything of your choosing. That allows us to achieve a little security through obscurity. Someone would actually have to guess your admin path in order to attempt to log in. Some of these other options are pretty self-explanatory. One of the things I like to do is skip the base validation when developing locally. Sometimes it has issues dealing with local URLs, such as magento.local. We can also check the use web server rewrites, even though this is referencing Apache. All this is going to do is not put the index.php as part of the URL like you see here. And since we're developing locally and don't have SSL certificates, I'm going to leave this option here unchecked. All right, and we can proceed with our installation wizard. Okay, so you'll notice that that last section may have taken a long time. It may have even timed out for you. So in the next video, we'll be going over the command line installation process, which is a workaround for any timeouts during the online installation. There's also a few tricks you can do in your terminal. If you take a look at your Etsy Nginx sites available Magento file, the virtual host configuration, you'll see that there's a few fast CGI commands elevating the timeout. So this is specifically for long-running Magento processes. And if you have something like this in your Nginx virtual host, maybe you didn't have issues timing out. But for those of you who did, hang on till the next video and we'll get things installed through the command line. Anyway, at this point, Magento is simply asking for a user account, and we're going to say admin sample.com, username admin, and password. You can use the password of your choosing. Encryption key is something you can leave blank. Magento will generate it for you, so we can continue. Here's your encryption key, which Magento generated. Now you can keep this in a safe place, or you can simply look it up at Etsy local.xml. Actually has your encryption key in it. B6A06, etc., etc. Matches this key. So at this point, Magento is installed, and we can proceed with logging into the admin. But I'll leave that for the next section. So let's recap. In the beginning of this video, we downloaded the Magento source code by checking it out from the SVN repository. This is a recommended approach for technical users that are familiar with SVN because it will help you upgrading Magento in the future. Next, we set up a MySQL database user so that Magento has its own user and doesn't have to share an account with other applications on the server. Following the installation wizard was pretty straightforward. However, if you run into any timeout issues or the installation crashes, you can stay tuned for the next video where we'll be going over an alternate installation method via the command line. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Mastering Magento. In the last video, you saw the standard installation wizard for Magento. However, if you want to automate installations or simply don't care for installation wizards, Magento also provides a command line installation script. This video will step through the process of installing Magento via the command line tool that's shipped with the source code. Let's get started. First things first, you want to be sure that your server has the PHP command line binary installed. You can check this by issuing the command which.php from your terminal. This should give us a path to the binary file to run PHP command line scripts. If PHP command line is not installed, make sure you install it from your software repositories for your Linux distribution. Once you have the PHP command line binary installed, you are ready to run the Magento installer. We can find the installer in the Magento document root, so let's go there now. In this folder, we'll see an install.php script. Let's open that up. If you take a closer look at the comments in the beginning of the file, you'll see that it's documenting the various command line options. You might recognize some of these because they match most of the wizard form fields that we saw in the last video. We simply need to build our command using these options to specify the appropriate locale information, database connection, and store settings. Our command is going to look something like this. And when we run this command, it's going to install our Magento store. This might take a while, so I'm going to fast forward through the video. Once the install script is finished, you'll see a success message with the encryption key displayed on the screen. At this point, two important things have happened. The Magento database has been populated, and your local XML configuration has been saved. You can find this local configuration file in app, Etsy, local XML. If you're curious, you can open that file to see exactly what Magento put in there. Most of this should look familiar because these are the options that we passed to the command line script. Let's make sure our Magento server is up and running. Looks good. So there we have it, a successfully installed Magento server. In this video, you learned how to install Magento via the command line interface. In a later section, you will learn how to write your own command line tools using the Magento framework. Coming up next, we will be setting up multiple storefronts in Magento, so stay tuned. So far, we've gone over 2 different ways that you can install Magento, through the online installation wizard and via the command line interface. At this point, we are ready to continue configuring our Magento server. In this video, you're going to learn about the multi-store mode that Magento offers. We're going to be setting up multiple storefronts that will be managed from the same Magento backend interface. Let's get started. We are going to start things off in the Magento admin. We configure our multi-store setup by navigating to System, Manage Stores. On this page, we can declare different websites, stores, and store views. In this example, we will be adding 2 new websites to our Magento system, one for selling gizmos and another one for selling widgets. We start by clicking on the Create Website button and filling in the form fields that appear. The website name is what you will see in drop-down lists throughout the Magento admin. The code is how you can refer to the website programmatically. Sort order is optional, and if you leave it blank, the websites are sorted by alphabetical order. Next, we need to create a store container for our Gizmo website. Clicking on the Create Store button takes us to the form where we select the website and the root category for this store. Again, when we name the store here, this is the value that will appear in a variety of drop-down menus. The last thing that we need to do is create a store view. Click on the Create Store View button. The form we see is very similar to the last 2. We select our store that this view belongs to, give it a name for the drop-down lists and labels throughout the admin, and provide a code so that we can programmatically refer to this store view. And of course, you want to enable your store view. Take a moment to do the same thing for the widget website. Make sure to use different codes for your website and store views. When you're done, you should have something that looks like this. Now that we have our websites created, we need to set their front-end URLs. This is done by navigating to the System Configuration and changing our current configuration scope to our website. We then need to navigate to the General Web tab and change both the unsecure and the secure base URL. We do the same thing for our widget website. At this point, we have our multiple stores set up, but they're still not accessible in a web browser. Before I show you how to set up your web server to route requests to the appropriate store, let's take a look at how Magento's index.php file is handling these requests. If you use your terminal and open up the Magento index.php file, and then scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see 2 lines where Magento is determining a mage run code and a mage run type. As you can see, these default to a blank value for the run code and a value of store for the run type. This is going to run the default store. But you can also see in these lines that Magento is looking for a server variable called mage run code and mage run type. We set up those variables in the Nginx virtual host configuration file. That file is in etc nginx sites available Magento. The first thing we need to do is add our host names to the server name line. We also need to add some lines to the beginning of this file outside of the server block. These lines map the host name to a particular Mage run code and Mage run type. This is only giving us a variable in Nginx, so the last thing we need to do is pass those variables along to PHP. I already have these lines in here and commented, but if you don't, you would have to add a fastCGI param line that passes the Mage run code to the Mage run code PHP parameter. So once I save this, the last thing I need to do is restart Nginx for those changes to take effect. I also need to make sure that I have the proper host names configured in etc hosts. That completes the multi-store setup. Our website should now be visible in the browser. You can see that both sites still have the default theme, so let's change one. Now the widget site has the modern theme, and the Gizmo site remains the same. So let's recap. First, we configured Magento by creating websites, stores, and views in the admin. We also changed the base URL in the system configuration. Next, we edited our web server configuration so that we could map host names to store run codes. With these changes in place, we successfully set up multiple storefronts hosted on a single Magento server. Coming up next, we'll start learning how to extend Magento through custom programming, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Mastering Magento. In the last section, you learned how to set up your server and install Magento. This video will introduce you to the development tools that will be used throughout the rest of this series. I will be using Sublime Text as my editor of choice. Unlike other IDEs, Sublime is lightweight and super fast. It supports many plugins that provide features comparable to IDEs like Zen Studio and Eclipse PDT. You can download Sublime Text 2 from their website, or if you're running Ubuntu, you can install it from a PPA that you can find on the webupdate.org site. Out of the box, Sublime provides some helpful features for navigating the Magento codebase. Let's take a look. In my Sublime editor, you can see that I've created a Magento project which contains the document root folder. I can use Sublime's GoToAnything feature to quickly open files. For instance, let's say that I want to open the Mage Sales Model order. I can start typing Mage Sales Model, and you can see I've already shortcutted through a lot of directories. I can scroll to the proper model I want and open it. Or if I want to jump right to a specific function, I can use the @ sign and start typing my function name. This functionality is super helpful, especially when traversing the deep object hierarchy of Magento. Earlier I mentioned that Sublime supports a variety of plugins. Those are pretty easy to set up. You can find directions online. You search for Sublime Package Control. Your first hit is what you want. The installation is simple. You merely need to copy this snippet of code into the Sublime console. Once you have Sublime Package Control installed, you can access it by pressing Ctrl, Shift, and P at the same time in Sublime. This brings up your menu. Through here, you can install a variety of packages. One of the most useful packages I find when developing Magento is the ctags plugin. The ctags plugin indexes all of your class definitions and function definitions so that you can easily jump to them throughout the editor. You need to first rebuild the tags on your project, and this may take a while. So that only took about a minute to index all of my function names and class definitions in the whole Magento codebase. At this point, I can now highlight pretty much any snippet of text, and then right-click it, and select Navigate to Definition. If there's multiple definitions for this snippet of text, Sublime will give me an option to choose one. I can see easily which components in Magento these belong to. In this case, I want to go to the first one, in the sales order, and it takes me right to the line where that function is created. There's also a few options that can be configured in Magento to make development a bit easier. For instance, you can enable developer mode in order to view more verbose error messages on the screen. You would do this in your web server configuration, so if you're running Apache, you can do it right in your htaccess file. But since we're using Nginx in these videos, I would edit it in my etc Nginx virtual host. You can see at the bottom of my file, I've already got the Mage developer mode fast CGI parameter commented out. If I want developer mode on, I simply need to uncomment this line, save my configuration, and restart my web server. You can also make some changes in the Magento backend to the system configuration. When you log into the admin, go to System Configuration. Then scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page where you see the Advanced section. Click on the Developer link and then expand the Log Settings field set. Here we can enable logging to give us more information about errors that occur in the system. On a final note, you can also find a lot of useful extensions available on Magento Connect. There's even an entire category devoted to developer tools. In this video, you were introduced to the Sublime Text Editor and how it can be used as a lightning-fast editing platform for Magento. You were also introduced to a few Magento configuration settings that assist developers. Lastly, you learned that Magento Connect hosts a variety of third-party extensions that make it easier to debug and investigate Magento functionality. In the next video, we will start putting these tools to work by creating our first Magento module, so stay tuned. In the previous video, you were introduced to the development environment that we will be using throughout the rest of this series. In this video, you will be able to put those tools to use by creating your first Magento module. Let's get started. We will start by adding our module's code to the Magento folder structure. It will go in App, Code, Local, where we add a folder for our namespace, and within there add a folder for our module. In this case, we will simply call it Example. Inside of our modules folder will go a collection of subfolders. The etc subfolder will hold the configuration files for our module. The primary config file is simply config.xml. That looks something like this. In our config.xml file, we're specifying the module name, which is composed of the namespace mastering Magento, followed by an underscore, followed by the module name, which is example. Here we're specifying a version of 0. Later on in the global section, we define the class path for our models, blocks, and helpers. To complete the setup of our module, we're going to create the rest of the folder structure as well as the default helper. I'll first create a folder for my model classes, and then a folder for my block classes. Another folder that our module will eventually use is the controllers folder. This can be challenging to remember because controllers is the only folder that's all lowercase. Lastly, let's create the helper folder. By default, Magento is looking for a data helper in each module that it loads. This file will be located in the helper folder in a file called data.php. It will look something like this. If you look at the name of our class, you see that it starts with the namespace, followed by the module name example, followed by helper, which is the folder that we're in, followed by data, which is the name of our file without the PHP file extension. All helper classes should extend the MageCore Helper Abstract class. We can use our CTags plugin, which you installed in an earlier video, to navigate to the definition of that class in order to investigate which functions we're inheriting. If I use my Ctrl-R shortcut key to bring up the list of function names, you can see there's a variety of functionality that we inherit. For now, our Magento helper can simply be an empty class. The mere existence of this class will allow Magento to successfully load the module. But there's still one final piece in order for Magento to properly load our module. We need to add an XML file to the app, Etsy, modules folder, which tells Magento to actually load our module. The file will be named as our module is, with the namespace preceding the module name. It's going to look something like this. Here we are simply, again, referring to the module by name, specifying that it's active, and telling Magento which code pool to use. This code pool determines which folder in app code Magento will be looking for this module. We can also define dependencies for our module. In this case, our module doesn't depend on any other functionality in Magento. Once this module is saved, it should be loaded by Magento. Let's fire up the admin and take a look. Once you log into the backend, you can verify that a module has loaded by going to System Configuration and then scrolling to the very bottom of the page and clicking on the Advanced link. Inside of the field set called Disable Modules Output, you should see listed all of the various modules that are loaded into the system. As we scroll down the page, we see our own module listed here, so we know that it's been loaded into the system. So to recap, we started out by creating the folder structure for our module in app code local. You learned what the Etsy configuration file looks like and which configuration files are necessary to actually load the module into Magento. Coming up next, we're going to make our module useful by adding a new controller to the front end of Magento, so stay tuned. Now that you have your first module created, we're going to take things to the next step by creating a front-end controller. The front-end controller is what is going to allow content to be loaded into the web browser. So let's get started. The first step is to edit our module's config.xml file. In the config file, we're going to add a new section for the front end. In this snippet of code, we're creating a new front-end router. What this means is that anything beginning with example in the URL will be routed to our controller. Next, we need to create a PHP class for our controller. Create a new file in the controllers folder, and let's name it Hello Controller. The PHP class is going to look something like this. An important thing to remember is that all controllers should extend from the Mage core controller front action when we're programming the front end. When a controller's route is dispatched, Magento looks for actions as functions within the controller. In this case, our controller has a single action, the world action. So once we save this file, we should be able to view this page in the browser. Our URL is going to include our front name in the very beginning, followed by our controller name, followed by the action. So what if we want just the front name example to provide a URL in Magento? Right now you can see that this page doesn't exist, but when we don't provide a controller and an action in the URL, what Magento is looking for is a default index controller and a default index action. I can quickly show you how that works. Let's duplicate our Hello controller and change it to the index controller. When we do this, we have to change the class name to index. And let's create an index action. Now, when we go to the magento.local/example URL, we should see that text that we just provided. This is how you provide a default controller and a default action for your module. Similarly, if we want example/hello to function properly, we need to add an index action to our hello controller. So let's recap. We started out by modifying the config.xml file for our module. We added a snippet of XML code, which declared a front name for routing all of our controllers. Next, we created the controllers themselves inside of our module. Coming up next, we'll turn these controllers into something a little bit more functional by adding layouts. So stay tuned. Now that we have our controllers created, we can move on to front-end layouts. A layout is a special type of file that is part of the Magento view layer. The layout file's XML syntax will determine which components will be visible on the Magento page. Let's get started. First, we need to edit the config.xml file in our example module. We need to add some tags to the front-end section. These XML tags will tell Magento to process an additional layout file. We need to create the file example.xml. That file goes in app, design, front-end, base, default, layout. You can see there's already a lot of core layout files. We just need to add our own. The example.xml file is where we define the layout. The XML tag on line 17 matches the URL that we'll be visiting in our browser. In this case, we're simply applying a 2-column layout with a right-hand sidebar. With the layout defined, I need to make one small change to my controller before it actually loads. If I look at my index controller now, you'll see I'm simply echoing text. This is never going to load the layout. I specifically need to tell Magento to do this. Even though the layout's been loaded, it still won't render. I also need to tell Magento to render the layout. Rendering the layout is typically the last thing you'll do in a controller action. So once I save this, I can now go back to my Magento page in the web browser, and I should see that it loaded my layout. So let's recap. We started out by modifying the config.xml file in our module. The snippet of XML code that we added declared a new layout file. Our next step was to create that layout file, example.xml. After doing so, we had to make a slight tweak to our controllers, telling them to load the layout and then to render the layout. Coming up next, you'll be learning how to create blocks and templates that will be loaded by the layouts we've created in this video, so stay tuned. In the last video, we set up a layout file in our example module. In this video, we're going to continue working with the Magento view layer by creating blocks and templates and loading them in that layout. Let's get started. First, let's add a template to our page using Magento's core blocks. We're going to need to open our layout file from the previous example. I can easily find that with Sublime Text's Go To Anything feature. So in the layout for our example landing page, we're going to add a reference to the content area of the page. In here, we're going to add a block of the type core/template. This block already exists and it's part of the Magento core. We simply need to provide the location to a template file. So let's create the example welcome template. That's going to go in app, design, frontend, base, default, template, and the path that we gave it is relative to this directory, template. So we need to create a new folder named example, and in this folder create a new file, and we'll name this file welcome.phtml. And if I put some text in here, we should see that on the screen. An alternative way of getting this to work would be to create a custom block. We can create a custom block in our example module by making a new file in the block folder. Let's call this file welcome.php. It's going to look something like this. You can see here on line 18, this is where we're setting the template that's going to be used for this block. One other change needs to occur. We need to change our layout to actually refer to our block instead of Magento's core block. So line 21 is going to change, and our type is going to be example/welcome. So when Magento is loading this layout, as it comes across this block tag on line 21, it's going to parse the type. It looks at example and finds our module. And then it looks at welcome and finds the welcome.php file. And that's how it knows which block class to load. So if I save this, and just to make sure that things are correct, I will add some more text to our template. So now when I reload my page, I should still be loading that welcome.phml template, and I am. So let's recap. The first way we went about loading a block inside the layout was by creating a core template block. This type of block points to a .html template file, which loads the content onto the page. The next way we went about adding blocks to our page was by using a custom block. In this case, we created a new PHP class for our block and set the template file in that PHP class. Coming up next, we're going to be kicking off a new section where you're going to learn how to extend the admin interface of Magento. So stay tuned. In the last section, we covered the basic building blocks of customizing the Magento front end. This section will explore some of the introductory techniques to customizing the Magento admin. In this video, you're going to learn how to add a menu item in the admin interface of Magento. So let's get started. First, we need to add a new configuration file to our Magento module. The file will go in the etc folder, and it will be called admin.html.xml. The XML code in this file is going to look something like this. In this case, we're adding a new menu item called example. The title is going to be what you see as the menu item, and the action is going to build the link for that item. Once we save the admin.html file, if we refresh our Magento admin, we will see the menu item. Clicking on the new menu item at this point won't take us anywhere, because we still have to create a controller for this URL. Before we create the PHP class for our controller, in our config.xml we need to add the following snippet of code. This snippet of code allows us to use the existing admin.html front name so that our URLs look similar to other admin URLs. It's basically going to tell Magento that our example module will also process URLs with that front name. Once this is saved, we can now create our PHP class for the controller. Because of the class path that we specified in our XML configuration, we need to create the admin.html folder inside of our controller subfolder. Inside of that folder is where we need to create the example controller. For now, this will simply be a controller with an index action. An important thing to note is that unlike a front-end controller, admin controllers must extend from a different root class, the Mage admin.html controller action. Once we save this file, you should be able to see this page in the browser. So let's recap. First, I showed you how to add your menu configuration to a new file in your module called admin.html.xml. This adds the menu item to the Magento admin interface, but we need a controller in order to do anything with it. So we had to first tweak the config.xml so that we could tap into the existing admin front name, and then we had to create an admin controller. And remember, admin controllers are slightly different than front-end controllers because they extend from a different core class. Coming up next, we're going to move on to another admin customization, and you're going to learn how to add system configuration fields to the Magento backend. So stay tuned. In the last video, I showed you how to customize the Magento admin interface by adding a link to the navigation menu. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Magento's system configuration fields to store values in the Magento database. Let's get started. In Magento, navigate to the System menu and click on Configuration. This area houses a variety of Magento configuration options. These are organized into tabs, sections, and field sets. A tab is the grouping of sections in the left-hand sidebar. When you click on a section, such as General, you'll see that the page loads a variety of field sets. You can expand and collapse the different field sets. And within each field set, you see a variety of form elements. These elements are the different system configuration parameters. When these values are saved, they get saved into the MySQL database that runs Magento. So let's say you want to add your own system configuration parameter for one of the modules you're developing. You can do so pretty easily by adding a new file to your module. That file goes in the etc folder and it's called system.xml. So adding a configuration field or field set to an existing section is pretty trivial. In this case, we're going to add a new field set to the general section that has a simple text field. So once we save this system.xml file and reload the general section, we now see our example options field set. This is the one that we just created. And in here we have our text field. The nice thing about adding system configuration parameters is that you don't need to create any controllers or models. It's pretty simple to get your fields, especially if they're only text fields, into the system configuration form. So let's recap. We showed you how to configure your module to add a new system configuration field to the backend. This is done in the system.xml file inside your module. We didn't go over all of the input types that can be added as a field, but if you want to see what they are, check out the variant data form element classes, which you can find in the lib folder. Also, fields can be scoped globally per website or per store, so that when you're having multiple stores hosted by Magento, they can be configured uniquely. When it comes down to using system configuration values in your code, you can use the mage getStoreConfig function to read the config values from the database. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how you can create models in Magento, which allows you to interact directly with the MySQL database. So stay tuned. In the last video, I showed you how to add a system configuration field in Magento. This is a very basic way of interacting with the Magento database. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a model. A model is a more advanced way to interact directly with the database. Essentially, it maps a PHP class to a MySQL table so that you can read and write data. So let's get started. First, we need to edit our config.xml file. And we need to tell Magento how to map models to different database tables. This snippet of XML will do that. We need to do one additional thing, and that is tell Magento to use these resources. With this code in place, we can start to create PHP models that link to the proper database tables. The example resource is preparing two database tables to be used by our models. We create our PHP models in the model subfolder. Let's start by creating a new file and saving it as event.php. The file is going to look something like this. The first important thing to note is that the model extends from a Mage Core Model Abstract class. Also, on line 17, we're initializing the resource for this model. In addition to the model class, we need to create a resource for these events. Create a new folder called Resource in the model subfolder. And inside of the resource folder, create a new file and save it as event.php. The resource class and the model class look similar. However, resources need to extend from a different core class, and we also need to initialize the primary key of the table. This table doesn't exist yet, so let's create it in MySQL. For now, we'll keep it simple and have one column just for the event name. We can test that our model is set up properly by using a controller. I'm going to use the controller from the previous exercise. And you can see I've already added the code necessary to test this. I'm simply instantiating the model class, and then I'm setting some data on the model and saving it. So this should create a new row in the database. The following lines are presenting a message to the screen telling me what the ID is so that I can verify that it's incrementing the ID each time. So with this saved, when I navigate to my back end of Magento and go to where my controller is loading the code, I should see this event saved message. And as I refresh the page, I should see that the ID is incrementing each time. So this means that our model is successfully saving to the database. So let's recap. The snippet of XML code that we added to our config file maps our database tables to our model classes. In order to read and write from these tables, we needed to create both model and resource model classes. When it comes down to using our models that we just created, we use the mage getModel function in order to retrieve an instance of that model class. And then we can use Magento's magic setters and getters to add data to that model. Once we save the model, it gets written to the database. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how you can use module installation scripts to automate the creation of your model's data tables in MySQL. So stay tuned. In the last video, you were shown how to use a model to write and read data to the Magento database. The tables that we created in the last example were done manually through the MySQL command line interface. In this video, I'm going to show you how to write a module installation script which automates the creation of MySQL database tables. Let's get started. Before we begin, make sure you remove the MySQL table we created in the last video. If you don't do this now, you may run into some errors when we're running the installation script that we're creating in this video. Creating an installation script will require us to make some changes to our module's config.xml file. We need to specify a resource for our setup. The setup resource is going to point to a specific class for our module. In this case, we're going to use a core class, so that all we need to do is create a SQL script. The SQL scripts go in a SQL folder inside of our module. We need to make sure that the subfolder inside of SQL matches the name of our resource. In this case, example_setup. When dealing with resource setup scripts, Magento pays attention to the version number of our module. In this case, our version started at 0.0.0. So we're going to need to create a script. We're going to name this file mysql4-upgrade-000-001. And just to test, we're going to simply die. So the last thing that we need to do is increment our version number to 0.0.1 and save our config file. Then when we go to the admin and reload the page, we should see the die message. So in reality, we want our setup script to contain SQL code that our setup class will run. It's going to look something like this. Inside of this PHP file, the this variable will reference the instance of the setup class. We can use that class to run SQL code. In this case, we're creating the table that was used in the previous example. So with this file saved, when we run the Magento admin, the page should load as usual. And now when we go into MySQL, we should see that our table for the events has been created. So let's recap. Like most Magento development, we started out by editing our config.xml file and adding a setup resource. When we add the setup resource, Magento is going to look in our module's SQL folder for any installation script. It uses the version tag inside of our config.xml in order to determine which scripts need to be run. On a side note, all of the current module versions get tracked in a database table. Coming up next, I'm going to introduce you to the event handling mechanisms of Magento and show you how to use a special type of model called an observer in order to harness those events. So stay tuned. Magento's event system allows you to extend the core functionality of Magento in a variety of ways without having to change core files. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create an observer in your module and use it to listen to different events that Magento is firing. Let's get started. In order to add an event observer to our module, we need to edit the config.xml file. By adding an events section, we can observe any number of the core events that are dispatched by Magento. In this example, we're going to observe the controller action pre-dispatch event. This gets fired anytime a controller is about to render an action. So in this case, our observer is pointing to a model class at the path example/observer, and it's going to run the controller action pre-dispatch method. So we need to create this class. That's going to go in the model folder, and it's going to be named observer.php. Observers don't need to inherit from any core class. It can simply be a class on its own. According to our config, we're looking for the method controller action pre-dispatch, so we need to create this as a public function of this observer. The function is always going to take a single argument. That argument is going to be an object of the Mage Core Model Observer class. So if I die inside of this observer, we will see that anytime we go to load a page in Magento, it's going to do so. This particular action and event is dispatched deep down in the Magento core. In the core controller variant action, there's a pre-dispatch event being triggered on line 528. This is what's eventually going to run our observer. An important thing to note is the array that's being passed as the second argument of the function. The array is going to give us variables in our observer which we can access and mutate in order to create the functionality that we desire with our observer. What this means is that in our observer, we can then retrieve that variable. Remember the observer that's getting passed to the function? That observer has a function called getEvent, which will basically give us access to those variables. So when the event is dispatched, we can now get the controller action. So at this point, I can pretty much do anything that a controller can do. Let's say, for instance, I want to simply log any URL parameters or post parameters. You can use the controller action to do so. Which means that anytime a page is loaded, for instance, if I attempt to log in, it's going to be logged to my system log. And you can see here the post request was logged. So let's recap. In order to use our observers, we need to add an events section to our config.xml file. The events section tells Magento which events we're going to be listening to and which observers we're going to forward those events to. When we create our observer model, we don't need to extend from any core classes, but we do need to create functions inside of that model. Those functions, when called, get passed an argument that allows us to access the variables related to each event. There's hundreds of core events being fired by Magento, but you can even create your own events by using the Mage dispatch event function throughout your extensions. In the next series, we're going to talk about some more advanced features that you can customize in the Magento admin interface, so stay tuned. Now that you have a taste for customizing the Magento backend, we're going to move on and try our hand at a few more advanced techniques, starting with building forms. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can build a form in the Magento admin interface. So let's get started. In my module, I've already added a new link to the admin navigation menu called Events. On that page, you'll see I've already created the necessary elements to render a form on this page. I'm going to show you exactly how I did this. First, I had to create a controller for this page. This controller is simply adding some content to the main layout. I'm adding an example admin HTML event edit block, which is a new block that I created. Looking at the block, you see that the class extends from a form container. This is a special type of object that Magento backend uses to create forms on the page. We need to set a few properties in the constructor. The object ID is going to be used later when we're saving the form information to the database, so we can ignore that for now. But the block group and the controller are important when rendering the actual form. If you look at the parent class, and you scroll down to the prepare layout function, you'll see that Magento concatenates the block group, the controller, and another property called the mode to create the path for the block that gets loaded as the form. So based on the parameters that we've provided here, we're going to load this block, the event edit form. This block extends from a widget form block. All we need to do is override the prepare form function, where we create a variant data form, add a field set, and add the fields that are necessary for this model. The add field function is inherited from some parent classes of this field set. We can find that in the variant data form abstract class. And if you take a look at what the add field function is doing, you'll see that the second parameter type is used to automatically determine the class name. You can see here it's concatenated to the string variant data form element. So as you can see here in the variant data form element folder, we have a variety of different class files. Basically, each of these correlates to a different type of field you can add to your form. When I jump back to my form, you can see I've added two date fields, And also, if you look closer to the array that's passed to the add field function, you'll see that the date field requires me to provide some more information, such as the format of the date. So that is all of the code that you need to render a form that looks like this. So let's recap. In order to create a form in the admin, we need to create a couple of blocks. The code in our controller added a form container block to the page. This block basically encapsulates our form by wrapping it with the title and the buttons. It determines which form block to load based on its own block group, controller, and mode attributes, which we usually set in the container's constructor. The form block that we created extended from the Mage admin HTML block widget form, which gives us a variety of methods to inherit from. To actually output the fields on the page, we had to override the prepare form function. In here, we created a form and a field set and used the add field function to link renderers to the different HTML outputs for the fields. If you want to see a comprehensive list of the variety of form elements that you can add, check out the variant data form element classes. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how to process data entered through this form, so stay tuned. The last video introduced you to creating forms in the Magento backend. In this video, we're going to continue by actually processing the data entered into the form. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is tell the form what action we're going to submit to. In our form container, we need to create a function called getSaveURL. This function returns a string, which is the URL that we're going to set the action parameter to. It's automatic, so once we reload the page, if we view the source on the form element, we'll see that the action is pointing to our event controller. So let's make sure we have that action created. In our event controller, we have the save action. Line by line, let's take a look at what this action is doing. First, we're gathering some parameters from the URL. This allows us to edit our event models in the future. The rest of this function is basically processing the post data the Magento way. Instead of using PHP's $_post variable, we're using the getRequest getPost function. This gives us all of the post data, which we can then add to our event model and save it in the database. The rest of the function is just logging some messaging to the screen, either successful messaging if the save occurs successfully, or error messaging if something went wrong. Finally, we redirect back to the form. So let's see if this works. So things are looking pretty good, at least the messages on the screen are indicating that. Let's peek at MySQL and see if the event was actually saved. And it looks like it was. So let's recap. In order to process data posted to our form, we had to add a getSaveURL function to our form block. Then we had to add the appropriate save action in the controller, where we could use the getPost function to retrieve post data and save it to our model. Coming up in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can list all of the models stored in your database in a Magento grid, so stay tuned. Grids are a popular type of block that you see all throughout the Magento admin interface. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can create a grid which will render a list of all of the models stored in a database table. Let's get started. The process of creating this grid that you see displayed on the page is similar to that of creating a form in the Magento backend. We're going to start in our controller. You can see I've modified my index action so that it represents a landing page for all events and lists them in a grid. I'm doing this by adding a new block to the content. This new block, admin.html event, extends from the admin.html widget grid container. This is a special container similar to the form container. You can see we still have the block group and controller parameters, which were also in the form container. And if we look at this parent class, in the prepare layout function, we'll see that it's also concatenating the block group and the controller, just like the form container. When our container adds the grid block, it's adding an admin.html event grid. This extends from the Mage admin.html block widget grid object, and we need to override two functions. The prepare collection function is responsible for building the MySQL collection. So this is what pulls the list of events from the database. The prepare columns function is pretty self-explanatory. We need to tell Magento which columns we want to display in our grid and also give it information like what is the type of the column. This helps it render the appropriate filters, such as for these date columns. So when we go back to the admin, the resulting grid looks like what we see on the page. Some of the cool things that a grid will do is add built-in filters so that we can filter for certain date ranges, and it also adds default buttons such as the Add New Event button. And as long as we have the appropriate default actions in our controller, it will integrate perfectly with the form that we created in the last video. So let's recap. In this video, I showed you how to create your grid blocks. Remember, you need to create two blocks in order to render your grid. First, you need the grid container, which contains titles, buttons, and the grid itself. Then you need to create your grid block in the appropriate place based on the block group and controller attributes of the container. When you're preparing your grid, you need to override two functions. First, the prepare collection function, which basically prepares the data from the MySQL database. The prepare columns function is going to determine which columns or fields from the database are displayed on the page. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how you can edit individual grid items, so stay tuned. You can leverage the use of grids to provide an interface for which you can interact with the Magento database, adding, deleting, and editing rows. In this video, I'm going to show you how to activate the interactive features of a grid in order to do this. Let's get started. You can see that I have since added a few more events to the system. Clicking on the rows in this grid doesn't do anything because I haven't programmed the interactivity necessary to actually edit these events. Let me show you how to do that in our module. We start by adding a new function to our grid. The function is called getRowURL, and it expects a single parameter. The parameter is passed to it, and it's the model for that specific row. So all we need to do is return the URL that we want to go to when we click on that row. In this case, it's going to be the event edit action, and we're passing the event ID as a URL parameter. So once I save that and refresh my grid, you'll see that mousing over each row results in a URL tooltip. So I can see that the URL that I'm going to be brought to is the actual edit page for that event. What I want to happen when I click on that link is for the form to pre-fill with the values for that particular event. Let me show you how this is done. It takes two changes to the code. First, in my controller, I need to somehow tell Magento what the particular event is that I'm working with. With these lines of code, I can detect if there's a parameter called event ID in the URL and then register a current event in the Magento registry. This current event variable is sort of like a global variable because the register in Magento is like a global storage unit. This allows me to refer to this variable anywhere else within the Magento code. Here I'm simply loading the model from the database. So the second part of this is that in my form, I can use this init form values function, which is inherited from the widget form. The init form values function runs after my prepare form function. Let me show you how that works. So in the parent class, the admin HTML widget form, there's a prepare form function and the init form values function, which is the one that we're looking at. So here you can see the comments indicate that this will be called directly after prepare form. And you can see in the rendering functions, it actually is called just after prepare form. So this is going to automatically be run by Magento. We simply need to declare it and place our logic inside. So we're doing two things. First, we're checking for the registered event, and we're basically taking the model's data and applying it to the form here. So this is only going to work if our keys and our form fields match up exactly. Otherwise, you would have to somehow manipulate the data, changing keys, or making sure things match up with your form. The second thing we're doing in this function is taking on any failed posts and using the data that was submitted. So we keep those changes and don't lose, like if you change the title but the form happened to fail during save, it will keep that change and just alert you with a failure message. So this also ties into some controller code, which I added to the save action, where when I catch an exception, I save that form data, the post data, into the session, and like you saw earlier on this line, this is where I'm retrieving the data. And also, just on a side note, the Boolean value passed here means clear that from the session. So in one go, I can get the data and clear it from the session so it isn't used on subsequent page requests. So with that in place, when I refresh this page, I should see the form data filled. And it is. So before I save this, let me draw one more change to your attention. I had to change the save URL because prior to this, we weren't passing the current URL parameters. So by appending this array attribute, we're saying preserve the current URL parameters so that our save URL includes the event ID. Let's just double check that this works. I'm going to rename my event and click on save. Looks good. We see that the event name has changed and everything's reflected in the grid. In addition to being able to edit our rows, we can also delete them. So we can see that Magento has already added a delete button for me. And the reason it's able to do that without us having to explicitly tell it to is because our edit form here, since it extends from a form container and we've specified the event ID, we can see that the constructor of that parent class right here on line 61 through 70, here it's detecting that URL parameter, the object ID that we've set in our container, and basically saying, okay, well, if I can find that, then this must be an existing event, and therefore I should add a delete button. So that's some pretty cool default functionality that we get. One thing that we do need to do is make sure that we can accommodate this delete URL. So by default, the get delete URL is returning just, wherever I'm at, whatever controller I'm at, the delete action. And again, it's going to pass it that event ID object. So let me show you what that should look like. In our controller, we should have a delete action, and it should look very similar to save. If you want to compare the two here, you can see I'm getting the event ID parameter, getting the model, and then instead of saving it, I'm just deleting it. And I have the typical error detection here. So when I'm done, if there's an error, I'm going to redirect to the edit page, otherwise back to the index. So let's save this and just double check that it works. I'm going to first reload the page just to be safe. Okay. Delete. By default, Magento adds a double prompt, so if you're deleting something, it wants you to be sure that's what you want. Okay, our event has been deleted, and surely enough, you can see that it's gone from the grid. So let's recap. In this video, I showed you how to make your grid interactive so that clicking on a row would take you to a form where you could edit the data in that row. We had to add a getRowURL function to our grid, and then in the controller, register the item that we're editing in a global scope so that we can access it inside of our form. In the form, the initFormValues function is what we use to access the registered variable and then apply the data to fill the form. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how to create mass actions on your grid, so stay tuned. Mass actions allow you to select multiple rows in your grid and perform a single task, such as deleting all rows selected. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up mass actions on your grids, so let's get started. Adding a mass action block to our grid is going to add a column of checkboxes down the left-hand side and an additional toolbar. I can show you how this looks on the customer's grid. You can see the checkbox column here, and the toolbar will allow us to select all or unselect all of the rows and then perform a particular action. So let me show you how we add this to our events grid. First of all, in our grid, we need to add a new function called prepare mass action. This is another inherited function from the parent class, the admin HTML widget grid. And you can see there's a few mass action functions that are inherited from that class. The prepare mass action function that we're going to be using is pretty much a placeholder, so all we need to do is create that function, and in that function we need to set a mass action ID field. This is part of the trigger that's going to tell Magento we have a mass action enabled grid. We also need to set the form field name on the mass action block. This is what's going to be posted to our controller. And then we can add a variety of items to our mass action block. These are going to show up in the toolbar. In this case, we're going to add a mass delete function so that we can select multiple events and delete them in one click. So before I jump back to the admin, I'm going to go ahead and create the controller action. So in my event controller, at the bottom of the file, I have my mass delete action. And what that's going to do is take the event ID's parameter. This is what we told our grid is going to be the mass action block's form field name. Okay, so what we can do is iterate over that, and basically for each event ID that we have selected, which is getting posted to this mass delete action, we want to load the model and then delete that model. And again, as in earlier topics, I have typical Magento success and error messaging. At the very end, we're going to redirect back to the index. Okay, so let's see how this works. I'm going to reload the grid, and we should see my checkboxes and my toolbar appear. Looks good. Now I'm going to add a few more events. Call this one test event 2. And once I have my events created, what I'm going to do is test my mass action by selecting each event and choosing the delete action. And once I have made sure I've selected the right events, I'm just going to click submit. And that looks good. So one thing that worries me is it didn't prompt me if I was sure I wanted to delete those. Let me see if I can change that real quick in my code. So I'm guessing there's probably some sort of on-click field I can add. I'm going to go ahead and look at another prepare mass action function. Let's see. I bet we can delete products. Alright, great. Here's an example. I didn't want to cut that. I just want to copy this and add it to my grid here. So now basically, let's rename my helper. Okay, so basically this should ask me if I'm sure I want to mass delete that. Let me test. Cool. So it asked me if I was sure. I actually don't want to delete that, so I'm going to cancel. And you can see that select all, unselect all, and if I had multiple pages, select visible and unselect visible, these all work. So let's recap. In order to enable mass action support on our grid, we need to override an inherited function called prepare mass action. In this function, we can add different types of actions which map to controller actions for processing. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how you can export your grid data into CSV or Excel reports. So stay tuned. Anytime you're working with databases, especially in a corporate or sales environment, it's important that you're able to export the data for use in reports or accounting or anything business related for that matter. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can add exporting functionality to your grids. Let's get started. Adding export functionality to our grid turns out to be simple. Let me show you how to do this. In the code, I need to first edit my grid and add export types to it. The normal place to do this is at the end of your prepare columns function. I'm going to uncomment these two lines where I'm adding a CSV and an Excel export type to this grid. The add export type function gets inherited from the admin HTML widget grid. You can see we're supposed to pass it a URL and a label. The URL gets turned into an actual Magento URL and the label is displayed on the screen. Where this happens is in the grid's template. I'm going to search for export types, and we can see that there's conditional tags in this file, which is basically saying if we've defined export types on our grid, we're going to output an additional toolbar and select menu for these export types. The last thing we need to do is add some actions to our controllers. Here I am in my events controller, and I'm going to uncomment these two actions, which essentially provide the functionality for exporting either as a CSV file or as an Excel file. Again, our core classes for the grid make this really easy because all we need to do is instantiate that type of block for our grid and then prepare a download response. This is an inherited function of our controller, and we're passing it another inherited function of the grid called getCSVFile, and for Excel, getExcelFile. I can show you what these functions are doing, but I'm not going to go too in depth. Basically, this is kind of a black box and some magic that Magento provides to us in order to convert a grid into a CSV or an Excel file. Let me quickly fix my doc block comments here so that my controller doesn't break. And okay, we're ready to reload the page and see what happens. So you can see it's added a small toolbar for exporting, and I can choose my file type, and then when I click on export, the page is going to load and a download is going to be saved to my computer. And here you can see that the Excel works seamlessly. Let's just verify that the CSV works. So by default, it's comma separated. And this looks like it's going to import into Excel perfectly. So let's recap. As it turns out, adding export functionality to our grid isn't too difficult. We start by editing the prepare columns function and adding some export types which map to our controller actions. The controller actions process the request, but we use built-in Magento functionality to get CSV file or Excel file representations of our grid. So that does it for this section. Coming up in the next section, I'm going to talk to you about programming the catalog, so stay tuned. The topics in this section cover ways of programming the Magento catalog. We're going to start off by customizing our own product type in Magento. Let's get started. Before I show you how to create your own custom product type, let's first take a look at a couple of examples in the Magento core. If you navigate to the Mage Core Catalog module and take a look at the etc config.xml file, at around line 470 you'll see where this module is adding the default product types to Magento. So we're in the global XML section here, and this module is adding a catalog tag with the different product types defined in here. You can see the simple product type, the grouped, configurable, and virtual product types as well. The different parameters in here dictate kind of the functionality of each of these product types. So you can see the simple product type, all it's doing is specifying a product type model. This is kind of like the minimum bar required to create a new product type. You can see configurable and grouped product types also have custom indexers and custom price models. So you can override more functionality than just the simple product type model. Another example we can look at is the downloadable. In downloadable, their config file is also loading a product type around line 150. And you can see it's loading a downloadable product, but then we also have a few extra tags here. So what this is doing is basically saying a downloadable product can be part of a configurable product or a grouped product. This is something important to remember when you're creating your own custom product types, because at some point somebody might want to bundle or use your product as part of a configurable product. Let's take a look at how we would do this in our own module. Let's go back to our example module, and this is the same code I've been using from the last section. We're going to build on our event models and make a event registration type of product. So I already have the code in my config.xml file just commented out, so I'm going to uncomment that now. Let me show you what we've done. Basically, we've created an event product type and specified a product type model. We haven't specified any pricing model because we can inherit from the core model for pricing. You can also see that I'm going to be able to group or configure or bundle these product types. So let me save this. Alright, so one thing we need to do before loading the Magento admin is create the product type model. And I have that here in model product type event.php. And for now, all we're going to do is extend from the abstract class for product types, and later on we will be adding different functions to this class to do different things. Alright, let's take a look at the Magento backend. To test that our product was created successfully, we're going to go to Manage Products and click on the Add Product button. And now we should see in this drop-down list of product types our custom one. And here it is, Event Registration. So everything seems to work fine. One thing that doesn't work yet is the attributes. You can see it didn't bring any of the prices over. And that's something we'll have to go over in another video. But for now, this is the basic way to create a new custom product type. To recap, we followed 2 steps to set up our custom product type. We first had to add the catalog section to our config.xml file, and we looked at examples in the Mage catalog and Mage downloadable modules. Then we had to create what's called a product type model, and this model needs to extend from the Mage catalog model product type abstract class. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how you can add custom product attributes to your product type, so stay tuned. Magento's entity attribute value, or EAV structure, allows you to add different sets of attributes to different types of products. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can add custom product attributes in our module, so let's get started. When creating a custom product type in Magento, the attributes, whether you create them through the admin or programmatically, have a special property called apply to. If you look at the price attribute that I've navigated to in the admin, you can see that its apply to property is set to selected product types and it's excluding our event registration. So of course you could go through and set these all manually, or you could go into the SQL, navigate to the table. The table is going to be called catalog EAV attribute, and you can see in here that there's an apply to column, and some of them have comma-separated lists of product types. I mean, you could update this manually, but that's a pain, so I'm going to show you how to do that in the module code. So the first thing I want to do is edit my config.xml file and increment my version number so that I can run a SQL script which will perform the necessary commands to update our product attributes. So in this script, I'm doing a few things. First of all, I need to instantiate a catalog installer. And the reason I need to do this is because I already have a setup resource that extends from the basic resource model. The catalog resource model has all the EAV related functions, so I actually need those. So I'm going to use the catalog installer anytime I need to do anything with entity attributes. So the first thing I'm going to do is fix the issue with product types that don't apply to my event product type. And I can use this snippet of code here. Basically get the table name using the catalog installer, and then run this update query to find any attributes that are applied to simple products and update it to apply to an event. And then while we're at it, I'm going to add a couple of attributes to my product. So the first attribute is just an event title, and that's simply a text field, and all I need to do is pretty much provide a label and tell Magento if it's required or not. The group is going to be a new tab in the left-hand side of the product edit screen. The second attribute is a little more advanced. It's actually going to be a select list where I can choose which event model this product is going to be selling. And I've specified an input type of select and a source. The source points to a model in my module. Let me show you that. Under model, product attribute source, event.php, I've created a class here with a getAllOptions function. So basically when you have a source, like we do here, Magento is going to try to populate the select list with that source using its getAllOptions function. And all I'm doing is iterating over the event collection, returning the IDs and names of the events. Okay, so let's head on over to the admin again and refresh my price attribute. So we should see event registration is now selected, and let's see what other attributes we have here. We should have our 2 event attributes added as well. Event ID and event title, good. And so let's see how this looks on the product edit page. So when we add our new event registration product, you should see on the left-hand side the new tab that we created, event settings, perfect. And you can see the select list has pulled in all of the names, and if we even inspect that element, you should see the correct IDs for the values of each option. So let's recap. After we incremented our module's version number, we were able to use an upgrade script to add the attributes to our product type. Also remember that if you're creating a new product type, usually you need to apply the already existing attributes to that product type. Coming up in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can create some advanced product editing screens, so stay tuned. In the last video, I showed you how to create custom product attributes and edit your product through the admin interface. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can create your own custom tab on the product edit screen. Let's get started. So on my product edit screen, you'll see that I've replaced the event settings tab from the previous exercise with an event information tab here. And on this tab, you can see that customize it quite a bit. It still has the event drop down where we can select which event this is going to pertain to. But I've also added this custom interface for adding tickets or removing tickets. And basically, this is going to allow us to sell, special types of tickets for our event. For instance, you might have a VIP ticket that costs a little bit extra versus your general admission. So let's go ahead and dive into the code so you can see how this is done. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our module is adding a layout to the admin interface. So in our config.xml, I've added here a section of XML code which basically tells Magento to process a layout file with our module. Let's take a look at that layout file. Alright, so in this file, we're utilizing a special handle. This admin HTML catalog product handle is going to append the product type here and load any layout updates. Forget exactly where this is running. It might be running in the controller. So in the admin HTML catalog product controller. Yeah, so we can see this is exactly where Magento is doing this, basically right here. It's going to load the default layout and the actions layout and this concatenated string is going to become admin HTML catalog product event, and that's going to load our layout. So what our layout is doing is basically referring to the product tabs and adding our own event info tab. So this is just going to put it right at the bottom of all the tabs on the left-hand side. And we're using our own block. It's going to be an admin HTML catalog product edit tab event block. So we can see that here. And the block is pretty much a standard admin block, except that we're going to implement the tab interface. This gives us some functions to override. Take a look. So we need to set a tab label, a title, and tell Magento if we can show the tab. So this is useful for permissions processing. So maybe a certain admin user can't or doesn't have permissions to edit this event info. But in our case, we're going to allow any admins to edit. So in our constructor, we set a template, which we'll come back to later. I just want to show you a couple other functions in here. You can see the interface functions we've overridden. We're always going to show the tab, and it's never going to be hidden. And then I have a few other kind of utility functions for getting button HTML and the get ticket data, which is going to parse the product to retrieve all the tickets that have already been saved. Okay, so we can jump into this template now. So here it is. So this actually goes in the app design admin HTML folder. And this template, it's basically building our form fields for that tab. So if you jump back to the admin screen, you'll see we're adding the product attribute for the event ID, that select list, and then we're adding this custom table. And in my template, you can see this is where we add the field for the event select list. And I'm kind of hacking my way through a way to render that select list just by using the raw variant data form element, not using any Magento form widgets. So that's how you would do that. And then in the table, I kind of borrowed this from the downloadable product type and tweaked it. Basically, it's just a table layout, kind of, self setup. But then there's some JavaScript here that has a template for each row. And basically, the template is what gets added to the DOM when the add button is clicked. So the add button observes a click event, and when the add button is clicked, it adds a new row to the table. One of the cool things about Magento is that when we build this form, we really don't have to do too much to get it working. All we need to do is make sure that our name attribute of each form element starts with product, and then we can assign any name to the indexes in that name. So let's recap. First, we had to create an admin layout for updating our custom product type. In the layout, we were able to inject a tab into the product edit form. Overriding the tab block allows us to set the tab's title and set the visibility of that tab. Any custom form fields we include in our template should follow the Magento naming structure so that when data gets submitted to the form, we can begin to process it. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to process that data, so stay tuned. The last video only took us halfway through some advanced editing techniques. Now I'm going to show you how you can save that data into your product models. Being able to save this data persistently will require a couple of steps. We basically need to create the appropriate models for saving these related tickets. And let me show you how we do that. So first, in our config.xml, we lay the groundwork for our models by telling Magento which database table to store our ticket information in. Once that's done, we need to also upgrade our database, and we create the SQL upgrade script that's going to create that table. So our ticket table is going to track which event and which product it's related to, and also the title, the price, and the sort order. Our model classes are pretty simple. You can see that in the ticket model, we're just constructing the basic initialization of a model. And we have pretty much the minimum possible work done to create our collection as well. So with all that in place, we can start to tweak our product type model so that we can first load the pre-existing ticket. So you'll see when I refresh this page, it's loading the pre-existing tickets from the database. So in our product model, the first thing I'm going to do is fix this get tickets function. And where this is being used basically is in my block where I'm populating the events. So down here, get ticket data. On line 101 is calling my product type instance here, getting the tickets, and then looping through them so that they can be used to build the front end. So this is kind of abstracted, but in the end, this is the most important function because this is where we need to select the tickets from the database. So in this function, I'm proceeding by setting up a collection, adding the appropriate filters to it, and I'm also going to sort by my sort order. And when I return the collection, that can then be used to build the front end. So that's how we pre-populate the table. Let me show you how we save the data. So this save function is a magic function that Magento looks for, and if it finds it, it's basically going to allow you to process any extra logic that you want to occur when this type of product is being saved. So we don't have to add any observers or anything. This is all done through the product type model. So in this function, I'm basically checking for the event data. If you take a closer look at the front end, you'll see that all of these form elements have event data as the first index of the name. So that's going to be automatically set in the controller. Let me just show you real quick. In the admin catalog product controller. Alright, so in this controller, this is what's processing the edit action, and actually it's processing the save action when we click that save button. And you can see all it's doing is it's getting the post request as this variable called data, and then when it inits the product save, so here in the init product save function is where it's taking the product data and essentially setting or adding all of that data to the product model, which basically means any form data that's submitted we can access through the product model, even if it's not an attribute or if it's not a column in the product table. So that allows us to get our event data. From there, we can loop through all the tickets that are being set, and basically I'm checking to see if we need to delete something. Otherwise, I'm adding that ticket to the data. So you can see this allows us to both add new tickets and delete existing tickets. So let's recap. In order to save our information to the database, we first have to create the necessary models and then set up our database tables in an upgrade script. Next, we modified the save function in our product type model. This is the function that Magento runs anytime the form is submitted. The last thing we did was tweak the product edit tab so that it read information from the database. Coming up next, I'm going to tie this all together and show you how you can render the product information in the front end. So stay tuned. At this point, you should have a fully functioning custom product in the admin. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create custom front-end views for this product type. If you take a look at your product in the front end, you'll see that it's using the same template that Magento uses for simple product types. We want to be able to display the ticket information on our event page and allow customers to purchase a certain quantity of each ticket type, not a quantity for overall. So we're going to make a few changes to this layout. First, we want to edit our etc config.xml file and make sure that we have a front-end layout specified. So then in our front-end layout, we want to add a handle for our event type. So this handle is concatenated by Magento, and it's automatically loaded anytime you're on a product view page. If you scour throughout the Magento code base, you'll see a bunch of other product types, such as product type downloadable, product type bundle. This is how we get custom blocks and custom templates and override various aspects of the product view page specific to our product type. So the few things that I'm overriding, basically I'm adding a new product info section, and actually I'm using the existing default template for the product view. So I don't have to do too much here other than include this block. One thing I am doing, however, is overriding the add to cart template, and my version of the template for add to cart is simply going to do away with what used to be right above the button, which is the quantity text field. So instead we're going to have options section, which has quantity next to each of the tickets. And this options section is loading a new template. So the new template and the new block are the options block and the options template. So the block essentially gives us the ticket data, and you should recognize this function from the previous video, where we're getting the ticket data in the block, and that's feeding the template, so the template can make basically a list of the options and then do some dynamic pricing via JavaScript here. This is similar to how Magento's downloadable product type functions. So if you're curious, you can refer to that module. So once the options wrapper is specified in the layout, there's one more thing we need to do in order to enable it, and that is tweak our product type. So our product type needs to return true when Magento asks it if it has options. And the reason for this actually stems from the catalog view template. So in the front end, the catalog view template is basically laying out the different blocks on the page, but when it comes time to add the options wrapper, let's find it. It is right here. Oh, it's in one of these containers. So basically you can see we're checking if the product has options. So this is being called throughout the view template, and therefore we have to return true when Magento asks. All right, so let's reload this page and see what happens. So you can see the quantity option has been removed from here, and instead we have quantity on each of our tickets, and you can see the pricing being loaded here. And what this is doing is going to add $50 to our base price if I select one of those, and the JavaScript takes over and updates these prices. So let's recap. In order to add our custom view, we had to create a handle for our product type in the front-end layout. Then we overrode some blocks and templates in order to get the page to look like we wanted. We also had to make a small tweak to our product type model so that it returned true when Magento asks it if it has options. So that does it for this section. In the next section, I'm going to teach you how to program the Magento shopping cart. So stay tuned. In this section of Mastering Magento, we're going to be customizing the front-end shopping cart experience. In this video, I'm going to start by showing you how to customize the specific behavior of your custom product type in the shopping cart. Since we will be covering more areas of the Magento front end in this section, I decided to go ahead and install Magento's sample data. The sample data provides the front page that you're seeing now, with a variety of additional products in my database. You can install the sample data by navigating to the Community Edition download page, and then scrolling further down on the site where you can select the format of your sample data and download the file. Once you download the data file, you will need to remove your current Magento database and import the sample data in its place. Then, once you refresh the Magento homepage, it should bring your data up to date with the latest version and code updates from the previous videos. Something to note is that you will need to recreate any products and admin settings that we have performed in the previous videos. So once I got my sample data installed, I recreated the event product type from my last video. And that was the Magento launch party. So what we want to do is continue editing this product type so it works more seamlessly with the shopping cart. And in the last video, remember, we got the pricing working on the product view page. However, once we add it to our cart, we're going to see that and the shopping cart itself, the price for that event is not reflected properly. So there's many ways to do that. One possible way to do that would be to add a price model to your product type. If you remember from the previous video, in addition to the product type model, we could add a separate price model, and we could implement custom pricing in there. But there's also an easier way, and we can still use the default price model. So the default price model, which you can find in the Mage catalog, product type price, what this is doing is providing all the functionality for basic pricing in Magento. You can see it does base pricing, then you can see familiar names like tier pricing and group pricing. Those are familiar terms used in the admin. And this is also where special prices and discount prices are calculated. So since this is what our product type is using, we can actually tap into an event in Magento when calculating the final price. So this event will basically trigger and allow us to access the product. And basically, if we set the final price in our observer, Magento will pick that up on line 85 and proceeding. So let's go ahead and implement things that way. So we need to first observe the event, which I have commented in my config.xml. And I'm creating a new class for my observer and calling the getFinalPrice method. So that observer I have created here, and it simply is going to look at the product that's being passed to my observer, and it's going to get a custom option on the product called the info buy request. The info buy request is pretty much going to be the form values that are submitted. So I'll be able to get the tickets from the buy request, and for each ticket I will be able to add the proper price or price increase for each ticket. So again, once I set the final price, the Magento price model will pick that up after the event has been dispatched. So I'm going to go ahead and save all my files. And now when I reload the shopping cart page, I should see the updated final price. So let's recap. First, we created an observer for the catalog product getFinalPrice event. The second step was to process the info buy request in that observer so we could calculate our custom price. Coming up next in the following video, we'll be continuing some extensions to the cart item behavior, so stay tuned. Continuing where we left off in the last video, now that we have the pricing enabled on our product, we can also add some functionality to make our product more interactive in the shopping cart. For instance, when we're editing a product that we've already added to the cart, I want to be able to, first of all, pre-fill the quantities that I've specified, but also I want to be able to change these, and I want it to reflect my updated pricing. So the first place we need to change in our code to enable the form to pre-fill is in our product type. So in the event product type, I already have commented out a function that I've added called process buy request. So I introduced you to the buy request in the last video, and it's essentially capturing the form data that was submitted and saving it with that item in your cart. So processing the buy request will be able to essentially parse options out of the buy request, which can be used by your front-end view. So this is essentially a magic function that's called somewhere in the Magento stack, and what this allows us to do is use something in our template. So our template that we created in a previous video for our event options we can now use this line that I've added using a function called get preconfigured values. So the options that are processed from the buy request eventually show up in the preconfigured values. So I can get the data from that, I can get my ticket data essentially, and then I also added a value attribute to my text inputs. So I can test for my quantities just to make sure I'm not going to get any errors when there's missing variable, and simply echo the quantity for each ticket. So once I save these and reload my edit page, it should pre-fill my quantities. Good, and it also fixed the pricing on the page. So now I should be able to update my quantity by 3 VIP tickets now. And you can see the pricing is still updating. So another thing that I would like to do is be able to see from the shopping cart page exactly which tickets I'm buying. Again, we're going to add a function to our product type model. And the function I've already written is commented out. So when I uncomment my prepare options function, what this is going to do is essentially anytime a product is being added to the cart or added to some type of product list, it's going to essentially parse the buy request. So this is almost like the opposite of the process buy request function. So what I'm going to do is create an array called additional options. And this additional options array I'm going to add, label it with the ticket title, and give it a value saying I'm ordering this much of that ticket. So just the quantity. And what we do is add this as a custom option to the product. So we're not adding it to the options array that we're returning, but rather we're adding it as a custom option called additional options. And then essentially later in the call stack, Magento will look for this custom option, and it's part of the default product type renderer, so we don't have to add any new templates to Magento. So with this saved, I'm going to go back to my cart page, and I'll reload the page. Alright, reloading didn't do anything because that's only run on product add. So if I actually edit, and I'm just going to keep everything the same and just click add to cart, and this is actually going to trigger that function to run. So now you can see it's telling me which tickets I'm buying, and it's giving me the correct price, and everything's good. So let's recap. First, we added a process buy request function to our product model. This enabled us to store additional information in our product model, which could be used by our template. In the second step, by editing our template file, we were able to pre-fill the ticket quantities based on that buy request that was processed earlier. Finally, in our third step, we added a prepare options function to our product model, which allows us to check the quantities and the ticket information anytime a product is being added to the cart, and set the appropriate additional options for Magento to render, giving us more information about our ticket purchase. Coming up next, we'll be exploring features of Magento in controlling guest checkout, so stay tuned. Now that we've made it this far, we're going to dive right into controlling the way the checkout process works. We'll start off by controlling the guest checkout mechanism of Magento. Once we've added an event to our cart and proceed to the checkout, we'll get to the point where Magento gates the checkout process by requiring you to register or log in with a customer account. Guest checkout is a feature that Magento provides to allow you to check out without having to log in or register. But we don't want our event customers to check out as guests. So I can show you how Magento disables this in the downloadable product. First of all, in the downloadables config, in the front end section, there is an event called checkout allow guest. And so the downloadable observer is basically checking whether or not guest checkout is allowed for that store and disabling it. So here's the code in the observer where it's doing that. You can see this is a store configuration value that can be set to disable or enable guest checkout for downloadable products. So we're going to do something similar. And in our config.xml, we're going to add a checkout allowed guest observer. And this observer I'm going to create in a checkout class. You can see I'm segmenting my observers, and I usually do this to keep the functionality for different observations in different files. This makes it helpful when upgrading or when using version control to track my observers, my module code. So my observer is my checkout observer, and I have an isAllowedGuest function, and I've just simplified what the downloadable product type is doing a little bit by simply disallowing any guest checkout for an event product type. So once I save my two files and I refresh the checkout page, we should see the first screen changes. So now I only have an option to either register or log in. So let's recap. Controlling guest checkout is really simple. There's only one step involved, and that's to create an observer for the checkout allowed guest event. Coming up in the next video, we're going to be creating a custom payment method, so stay tuned. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can create your own custom payment method to further customize the checkout process. So creating a custom payment method is actually quite simple. We start out by adding a payment method model in our module. In our example, we're going to be creating an in-person payment method so that people can pay for our events when they arrive. All payment methods need to extend from a Mage Payment abstract class. So in that abstract class, you can see there's a lot of properties and functions to inherit. The properties provide a way for you to easily pivot on certain booleans. For instance, can this order be refunded? Can you use the checkout internally, which means the admin interface? Can you use the checkout, or can you use this payment method in the checkout, which means the front-end interface? And a variety of other booleans that you can specify as properties to your overridden class. So one that you do need always is code. So in our case, our code is in person, all lowercase. So you can see there's a lot of Boolean functions that simply return the properties. These are used throughout mostly the Magento sales module to tell if the payment can actually process the order. And one of the things you can use these for is if your logic isn't simple yes or no for your payment method, you can use the function, you can override that in your custom payment method to make it conditional. So like maybe you can only use this, you can only refund certain product types or certain payment methods that came in with specific data. You can use the function to kind of conditionally switch that on and off. So one important function to kind of help you understand how the payment methods work is the isAvailable function. So you can see that at some point in this function, there's a method or an event that's dispatched. The payment method is active. You can use this to extend other payment types, and maybe you want to disable one for the front end, but keep it active for the admin interface, like a check money order. You don't want people paying with check money order on the front end of the website, but you would like to put admin orders in as them in case someone phones in or mails in a check. So you could do that using this event and observing that and changing the result to make it unavailable on the front end, but available on the back end. Another thing that the isAvailable function is using is this getConfigData. The getConfigData function is basically a wrapper, and it does a little bit of the work for us when pulling values from the system configuration. So it basically builds the path for us based on the code. So it's always going to look in the payment section and whatever group matches our code name, and then look for the field which is being passed to the config data function. What this means is that all we have to do is add to our system.xml the appropriate fields. So this active field is going to be used in the isAvailable function when we're saying get config data active. Also, the title is going to be used when we're calling get title. And so these functions are called throughout the Magento core, and get config data essentially wraps this in system configuration fields. So the fields that I typically need in my system configuration are active, title, and order status. And order status is using a special config source. So this config source gives you the order statuses you can select from a dropdown that will be the status of any order coming in with this payment method. And typically it's either using the source for order status new or order status new processing. But if you look at the class this extends from, there's also a source of all the order statuses. And sort order is self-explanatory. There's actually one more field we need to add here. And I'm just going to copy it from the Mage payment system, which is typically where you want to start when you're building your configuration for your payment methods. Okay. So what I need to copy over is the allow specific and specific country fields. Basically, these are telling Magento if you can use that payment method for the country that is in the billing address. And again, these use their own system config sources for specific countries or all countries. All right. So the last thing we need to do is add some defaults to our module's config file. In the bottom of the config, I added a default section. And you can see that the child tags match the config path: payment, in person, and then active, model, order status, title, allow specific, group. So the model and group, these are, think of them as hidden config values. So the model, there isn't a field in our system.xml for model, but Magento needs to look at this default value in order to find your actual payment method model. And group is a way for Magento to specify either online or offline payment methods. I'm not quite sure exactly what this determines, but obviously in-person payment would be an offline transaction. So once we save this, we should be able to move to the front end now. So you can see I'm already in the checkout process and I've added an item to my cart. I'm just going to complete my billing information. And as I proceed through the checkout, on the payment information page, you'll see I now have my pay in person method available, and I can select it and continue and place my order. So there you have it, one of the simplest ways to create a custom payment method. So let's recap. Creating our payment model took 3 steps. First, we created the payment method, which extends from the Mage Payment Model Method Abstract class. Then we set up some system configuration fields in Etsy system.xml. These fields are accessible through the payment method model's getConfigData function, which comes in handy and is in fact used automatically throughout a lot of the Magento source code. Finally, we had to add some default values in Etsy config.xml, including a couple of hidden values which were explained in the video. Coming up next, we'll be adding a step in the checkout process, so stay tuned. So far we've only made minor changes to the checkout process. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can add an entire custom step to the checkout process. So let's get started. Customizing the Magento one-page checkout is no simple feat. It's actually one of the more advanced customizations you can perform on the Magento front end. Looking at the one-page checkout screen, you see you have a series of steps in an accordion layout, which you progress through until finally placing the order. So I'm going to show you in the code how these steps are generated and then proceed by showing you how we can add our own step to the beginning of this process. In Magento, there's a module specifically for the checkout process in app code core mage checkout. The block that's being loaded on this page is the one-page checkout block. And we can find that file in the block folder, and it will be called onepage.php. So right off the bat, you can see that there's a function called getSteps. And what this is going to do is provide an array of step information. So what this is going to look like is an array for each of these accordion elements: billing, shipping, shipping method, payment info, and the review step. So there's a few functions one layer up in the class inheritance, and that's the getSteps code function. So if we look at the abstract block for one-page checkout, we'll see that these steps are hard-coded. So this is one of the challenges in overriding the Magento one-page checkout, is that the steps are hard-coded in the core. And one of the ways around this is to use Magento's rewrite functionality. I consider that to be almost as bad as a core hack. So I'm going to show you another way to customize the one-page checkout with a simple layout override. So the basic thing that we want to do is to be able to have our getSteps function return something different. And the way we're going to do that is to change where the getSteps function is being used. And where that's being used is in the one-page template. So in front-end base, default template checkout, onepage.php, this is the template that's being loaded by that one-page block. And this is where it's using the getSteps function. So if instead of looping through these steps, we can loop through our own, then we'll be able to add steps to the checkout process. So let me show you how we did that in our Mastering Magento example module. So in our module, first make sure that you have a front-end layout being loaded. Then in your front-end layout, see I have this section of code commented out right now. So this is the code that I need to add in order to change how the one-page checkout functions and add a step to the beginning of the process. Essentially, I'm taking the existing one-page checkout block and I'm changing its template by using the setTemplate action. And I'm going to use a template of my own found in example checkout onepage.php. So let me open side by side the core one-page checkout. So you can see both files are very similar. In the one-page checkout of my own making, however, in my for each loop, I'm using a helper method, example checkout, to get the checkout steps. And then again at the bottom, I'm using a helper method to get the active step. So the only real difference is in my for each loop and then at the bottom where I'm setting up the accordion JavaScript to get the proper active step. So what I've done is create a new helper called example checkout. And in my example checkout helper, I'll show you where this is. This is just in my example module in the helper folder. So I've created my own get checkout steps function. And what this is going to do is override one-step checkout data by retrieving the steps from that block that's already loaded into the layout. So this block gets loaded in the checkout XML layout. So on the one-page checkout, the checkout.onepage block here is being created. So we're using an already created block because I don't want to have to duplicate all of this work here. The checkout module is adding all these steps and adding these different blocks to the layout. I want to keep that. All I want to do is change the template so I can inject my own steps. So that's why I'm using the existing checkout block, so I can get the existing steps that Magento has already made. Then it's only a matter of injecting my own step information into the array. If it weren't for Magento conditionally having a login step, this would be much more simple, but since I want this to occur before billing, I have to kind of loop through and clone the array. My getActiveStep function is overriding the core checkout block, and this is basically returning either the event registration step or the login step. The next change to the layout is adding a custom block to the checkout page. So this custom block is going to contain my event registration form. So it consists of a template, which you can see is looping over all of the events that were purchased and all of the tickets for those events. So if I have one ticket where I have bought 2 of that ticket, it should print out 2 forms. So I have to loop through the events, the tickets, and then for each quantity of ticket, print out a form. And to make the template a little bit cleaner, this goes hand in hand with a registration block. Here, this is where I wrote the getEvents function to basically use the checkout session, get a quote, and loop through the items to find all the events. So with those 2 changes to the layout, overriding the checkout block and then adding in my own custom block for the form, I'm able to add a new step to the checkout. So now when I move to the front end and reload my checkout page, you'll see my event registration step in the very beginning. So let's recap. Overriding the Magento checkout process involves a handful of steps, but we can boil it down to 3 basic steps. First, we overrode the checkout one-page index layout to use our custom template for the checkout.onepage block. Doing this allows us to inject our custom steps into the checkout, which we did by using an additional helper method just to keep things clean in our template. Last but not least, we used our own custom block to render our event registration form, and that block was called Example Checkout One-Page Event Registration. Coming up next, I'll be showing you how to process orders in Magento, so stay tuned. Now that we've totally customized the checkout process, in this video I'm going to show you how you can process the information gathered in your custom checkout steps to process orders in the backend. Let's dive in. This order details page isn't showing us the ticket information for the Magento launch party that we purchased. So in order to process the ticket information and get it to show up on our order, we need to edit our product type and give it a get order options function. So get order options runs when the quote is being converted into an order And basically this will allow us to preserve the additional options which we added custom to our quote items. So this part is pretty simple, but actually processing the event registration data is a little more advanced. So for that, we're going to start in our custom one-page checkout template. So the example checkout onepage.phtml file, we've added a JavaScript library for our event product types. So this is a new file I've created in the skin. And this is modeled after the one-page checkout functions, which you can see in the op.checkout.js file. So the op.checkout file contains the JavaScript which controls the user interface for the one-page checkout. You can see there's a checkout object, and then there's an object for each step. So billing has one, shipping has one, and so on and so forth. So all this is doing is kind of controlling the AJAX functionality of the one-page checkout. So in our own event.js, we're creating an event registration class which represents our step in the process of checking out. And we need to initialize some things like which URL is going to handle the save operation and how to proceed to the next step. So I kind of just borrowed this from one of these simple checkout steps and refactored certain parts of it to make it work for the event registration. So the next thing we need to do is make sure that our event registration form is properly set up. So our example checkout one-page event registration.phtml file, I've refactored my form element names into the structure that I desire. So I want this to submit essentially an array of ticket information, and it's going to track the item ID. This is the shopping cart item, the ticket ID, the event ID, and then the attendee information. So at the bottom of this file, I added a snippet of JavaScript. This is utilizing my event registration class that I just showed you. So creating this JavaScript object, initializing the form, this is all part of enabling an AJAX interface for this event registration form. Okay, so in the front end, I'm going to go ahead and reorder this Magento launch party event. So I'm buying a total of 4 tickets, and so when I proceed to check out, I should see my event registration step. Alright, I'm going to fill this out with some basic information. So with the JavaScript in place, when I click on continue, it's going to enable AJAX to process the request and forward me to the billing information. So what exactly happened in the background there? Well, I'll show you. So the URL that I've given to my event registration process is checkout one page save event. So what I did was, in my modules config, I added some front-end controllers for handling my AJAX checkout methods. So I'm using a router to kind of tap into the Mage checkout URL structure. Because you can see I'm still using a checkout one page URL. I'm just going to inject my own controller in the process. So my controller is located in the controllers checkout folder, and it's called one page controller. And I can actually extend from the Mage checkout one page controller in order to gain access to functions like expirations for AJAX and getting the one page checkout type model in order to get quotes and things like that. So in this function, I'm looping through each of the items, processing buy requests, and basically I'm injecting the registrant information that was submitted into the buy request. So on line 49, I'm logging what that buy request looked like so you can see. In system.log, when I process that form which is being submitted, I'm essentially injecting the registrant information into my ticket array. So the ticket array was previously just tracking the ticket ID as an index and then the quantity, and now I've added this portion here. So what this is going to allow me to do is once my order is finally placed and everything is paid for, I can process the registrant info and get everything saved into the database. So this is kind of like a mid-level or an intermediate step to getting everything saved properly into a registrant table. So to drive this home, the final thing I need to do is add an observer. This observer is observing the sales order place after event. And on sales order place after, I'm basically going to process that buy request with all the ticket info. My observer is segmented into a sales.php file. And here you see I'm iterating over all the event items, retrieving the buy request, and for each ticket's registrant info, I'm saving that registrant to the database. So one thing I had to do in order to get the model to work properly is create a new SQL file, or rather update my original registrants table by adding event IDs and ticket IDs so that I can track these back to the proper events and tickets that were sold. Okay, so let's step through the entire checkout process. So once my order is placed, I should be able to see the information on the front end, and I can see the types of ticket that I ordered. And now let's verify that everything was saved in the back end. And it looks like we got the information in there all right. So let's recap. In order to process our order information, we took 3 steps. First, we added a getOrderOptions function to the product type model. This function gets run when an order is being placed. In the second step, we added additional JavaScript to the checkout steps so that we could save our registrant data via AJAX. We also had to tweak our config XML for our module a little bit so that we could add in the correct controller and router for intercepting that AJAX request. Finally, we observed the sales order place after event in our own custom observer so that we can process the registrant data that was injected into the info buy request. Coming up next, we'll be starting a new section focused on importing and exporting data in Magento, so stay tuned. So in the last video, I introduced you to the different import and export mechanisms of Magento. Now let's take things a step further and actually dive into the advanced dataflow profiles and take a look at what's going on under the hood. The main brains of the dataflow profile is this actions XML snippet that you see here. So let's dissect this XML and let me explain to you exactly what Magento is doing to this in order to call and refer to different PHP objects and methods, because essentially that's what dataflow profiles do. So first off, you can see that the XML is broken up into these things called actions. So an action is going to translate to a PHP object and a PHP method. So the type you can see is a Magento class path. That's going to become our object. And the method here is the particular function in that object that we want to call. Inside the action are a variety of child tags. You can see we have different variables here. So for instance, this first action has one variable called URI. These variables get used by the function. They're actually set typically as some sort of class variable that's able to be called by the function. So let's step through this XML profile and take a look at the actual code in the Magento code base. So the first object we want to look at is the dataflow convert adapter HTTP curl. So here is our object, or our class rather, and we're going to be calling the load function. And you can see right off the bat we're calling this getVar function. This is going to give us the value of that variable that we saw in our XML right here. And this function is pretty simple. All it's doing is using a curl class to actually download the file at that URI that we provided. So what this action is going to do is provide the data for the rest of our data flow process. Alright, so the next action is a parser, the dataflow convert parser CSV. So in the next class, we're calling the parse function. Here we've said to Magento, my method is going to be parsed. So that's what it calls. In the parse function, we can set different variables for the delimiter. So for instance, if this were a tab delimited file, we would be able to override that from the XML by adding a variable and putting a tab inside of it. Further on down the file, you can see that you can specify a variable called an adapter. And the adapter is what's going to be used to actually save the data into the Magento database. So the rest of this function is just parsing field names and parsing row data and saving it into the database so that it can be used by what we set here as the adapter. And if you look at our XML, our adapter is the catalog convert adapter product. So if you think that this profile is going to be importing product data, then you're correct. So let's jump back to our CSV parser real quick and let me show you the important thing to remember about adapters. In the CSV parser, the adapter method is pretty much manually set to be save row. So that's the function in our adapter that's going to be run. So in our product adapter, you see that save row gets passed some import data. That is the data that was parsed and then saved to the database. And in the save row function, it's essentially going to check for the store, check for the SKU, check for all these different required fields, and then perform all the necessary logic to get this product properly into the database. And I'm not going to go into detail in this section, but feel free to in your own time. So you can see that the data flow is essentially built from a variety of components. We have an action that loads some data, and then an action that parses it into something usable, and that action passes off the data to an adapter. So this adapter is ultimately what will be interacting with the database and saving our imported data. So if you've been following along, you may have realized that in the previous video our example isn't fully functional. In this video I'm going to show you how we can customize the dataflow adapter in order to fix the errors you're getting about missing a temporary batch file. So you can see I've changed my first action to use a different type of adapter. We're going to override the dataflow curl adapter by creating our own class in our example module. The code for our class is going to extend from the original curl adapter because we simply want to add a little extra functionality to it. And let me show you where the original adapter is falling short. So in our dataflow curl adapter, it's loading the HTTP URL fine, but on line 63 and 64, where it's calling set data, that's only going to save the contents into something that dataflow calls a container. And the container is only accessible in the running process of PHP. In our CSV parser, however, it's expecting to read the data from a file. So what this turns out to do is it makes the CSV parser only work with a different type of adapter called the IO adapter. But what we can do in our adapter is override the load function here. And what we're doing is we're calling the parent load so that we get the HTTP data. We can then take the data and using the batch model, which is stored as a singleton, we can open the file, write the data, and now it should be accessible by the CSV parser. So our file is just simply skew and test1. This isn't going to work for an import per se, but you'll see how it clears up the errors with my dataflow profile. So once I save my profile, I should be able to run the profile and I get past that error I was previously getting. So now all I need is a proper import and I'll be ready to go. So let's recap. Step 1 of writing our own Magento dataflow adapter is to update our profile's actions XML and give it the class path as the type of our first action. Step 2 was to create the new replacement curl adapter in PHP. The new adapter will extend from the original curl class. However, we're going to inject our own custom logic into the load function of that class. Coming up next, I'll be showing you how to import orders using Magento's dataflow, so stay tuned. So let's switch gears for a minute, and instead of importing products, I'm going to show you how you can import a sales order into Magento using dataflow. So let's start off by looking at our test import data. And you'll see it's simply a CSV with all sorts of order information, such as customer name, the product SKU and quantity, and shipping and billing info. So that's pretty simple. Let's take a look at the actions XML of our profile. So I've changed the actions XML a little bit. We're still using the curl adapter and the CSV parser. However, our adapter that's being used by the batch process is going to be a new adapter we create in our example module. So this convert adapter sales order is going to look something like this. And it needs to extend from the dataflow abstract adapter. And we need to override the load and save functions to avoid any errors. But the real function we want to work with is the save row function. The save row function is what's going to get run by the CSV parser for every row of that data set. So our function's getting past the import data, which is an array representation of each row in our CSV. We're going to see everything keyed by the column names, so this should be very simple to work with. So in order to programmatically create this order, we need to first make a quote. Quote is essentially the staging ground for the order. Think of it like your shopping cart. Every shopping cart on the front end has a quote saved in the database tracking what items are in the cart, the shipping, the billing address, and the payment method. So we're first going to add the store information and customer information to the quote. You can see I'm using a combination of a get batch params function and the import data. What get batch params is going to do is allow me to access any of the variables in my dataflow profile. So get batch params store is going to return 1. So that sets the store ID on my quote. Proceeding through the function, I need to add the product data to the quote. This is pretty simple. I just need to load the product by SKU and then use the quote's add product function and pass along the quantity that I want added to the cart. Next comes shipping address. Shipping address is pretty standard, setting all the information. There's some gotchas around region and country. Make sure you set the country ID, not set country. And also there's some gotchas with the shipping method and description, and especially with setting shipping rates. So I'm actually going to comment this out for now and show you what happens when that is not set. Billing address is pretty straightforward. You just set all the pertinent data, and it's very similar to the shipping address, except you don't need to worry about methods and shipping rates. And lastly, the payment method can be set in this way. Alright, before I explain what's happening in the rest of the function, I'm going to go ahead and run our dataflow profile. So let's make sure this is saved. And then we're going to run the profile. And remember, I commented out that one area in the shipping logic where I was setting or flag to collect the shipping rates. And what happens is we get this error. And it's pretty cryptic because it looks like we already set the shipping method up here. However, this has something to do with the way we convert a quote to an order. And what we're using is called a service model that Magento provides. It's kind of like a wrapper for making this conversion process pretty much a one-liner. So this service quote, what we're doing is we're calling the function submit all. And what submit all does is it takes the quote that's attached to this service object and it runs all these different calculations on it, and then it submits the order. And then the submit order function does some more stuff. So this is all converting a quote to an order. So the error that we're getting says specify a shipping method. But it looks like we did. So why is it saying that? So here's where the error is being thrown, and it's attempting to validate our quote and failing. And I can tell you for a fact, you can test this by mage logging. It definitely has the method set, and what it's missing is the rates. This is the key to getting those rates. We need to set the collect shipping rates flag to true. And when this is set to true, somewhere in the Magento backtrace function is being run and it's looking for this flag. And if this flag is set to true, it's going to populate the database with all sorts of shipping rates. And it actually goes so far as to store them in the database here. Even though this is the flat rate, it's going to put an entry here saying the price is $10 for this address ID 61, and you could trace these foreign keys all the way back to our quote and see that it relates to the quote that we're attempting to convert into an order. So hopefully that makes sense. But anyway, with this flag set and everything saved, this submission should now work. Let's refresh our profile runner. And no errors. That sounds good. Let's take a look at the sales orders. It looks like I've got my orders into the system. One characteristic that Magento shares with a lot of other open source systems is that they have a lot of flexibility around ways you can import or export data into the system. In Magento, if you navigate to the admin interface and go to System, Import, Export, you'll see three different options. You can either use the import or the export functionality, or you can use something called dataflow. Dataflow is the original import-export engine of Magento. Nowadays, it's preferred to use import or export when performing product imports, for instance, because import has more features around supporting categories or supporting configurable products. However, dataflow is still a very generic data transformation mechanism, and I'm going to show you how that works. In the dataflow profiles, these are some out-of-the-box customizable import and export scripts that Magento provides for you. You can edit these profiles, but simply by tweaking these parameters in the profile wizard. And what these different parameters do is provide to you a profile action XML. Now, this is read-only, and you can't change this actions XML. If you wanted to do that, you would need to create an import-export advanced dataflow profile. So you can see I've created one here, and the main difference is that the profile is completely customizable. So you have total control and you can bypass that simple wizard. So dataflow profiles provide a very extensible way to get information into and take information out of the Magento system. In the next video, I'm going to dive into the advanced profiles and explain to you how these actions XML actually works under the hood. So stay tuned. Creating a shell script in Magento is actually quite easy. By creating a shell script, we're going to allow our application to provide a command line interface for performing certain actions. In a default Magento installation, you'll find a handful of existing shells in the shell folder of your Magento root. So the three shells that ship with Magento are the compiler, the indexer, and the log. This custom.php shell is something that I've created for this exercise. You can run a shell by either locally opening up your terminal or SSHing into your server where Magento is installed. And using the PHP command line executable, you can run the scripts in the shell folder. So for example, the log shell provides a command line way for interacting with the Magento database logs. And every shell should have some sort of usage or help text to make it easy for you to kind of distribute your scripts and have them be used properly. This log script, we can check the status of the logs, and this is going to show us the size of all the different log tables in the database and also give us some row counts, etc. So creating your own shell script is quite simple. Let's first take a look at what that log shell script is doing and how it's constructed. So the class name for our shell follows the standard Magento structure. The prefix for all of the shells is made shell, and the class name should match closely to the file name of the PHP script. Now, it's not a strict necessity to have these names match because nothing's auto-loaded from the command line. You're specifically running this PHP script. The most important thing in the class definition is that it extends from the made shell abstract. So this is going to allow us to inherit the basic bootstrapping of a shell script. So in the constructor, we're bootstrapping the Magento environment and parsing command line details. And then further down in this file, you'll see the abstract function run that we must override in our class, and an example usage help, plus the getArg function, which is usually heavily used to process, command line arguments. So those are the functions we inherit from the abstract class. And you can see in this log shell, the developers have created a few additional, I'd call them helper methods. So they're little protected functions within the class, for getting the log model, for getting human readable file sizes, etc. And so the run function is usually like the meat of your shell. And you can see a typical if-else statement checking for the different types of arguments. And these match up with the usage help that you saw earlier. Now we can do a clean operation, or we can display the status. And so in the code, if we're doing a clean operation, here's the code that runs for that. Also, if we're doing status, here's all the code that runs for that and builds that little table you saw. Otherwise, if it's an unrecognized command, print the usage help. And usage help just abstracts that, so you could use this function anytime, say, you're throwing some other type of error. If there's like a missing option in the clean routine, you could echo the usage help again with an additional error message or something like that. So like I said in the beginning, the class name isn't super important because at the end of the shell, it's just going to instantiate itself and then run it. So there isn't any auto-loading of this shell file specifically. You're simply saying PHP, run this PHP file, and that PHP file is going to instantiate itself and call its own run method. So when you're creating your own custom shell scripts, it's pretty easy to take one of the out-of-the-box shell scripts and just copy it into your own file. And that's how I started out with the custom script. And all I did was I changed my class name to make it unique. I changed my run function to have it do what I want. And I tweaked the usage help to match my new shell script. And remember, since we're changing the class name, we want to change the class name on the second to last line of this file. So this is simply a hello world shell, and I'm just going to show you that it works. So without any options, it's going to give me the documentation for the shell, and my hello world example works. So let's recap. First, we spent some time reviewing the out-of-the-box shell scripts that Magento provides. Creating our own shell script is simple. It's as easy as creating a PHP class. You should always make sure to have, at minimum, a run function and a help function, so that your shell script is usable by others who you may be sharing your extensions with. Coming up next, I'll be showing you how to bootstrap Magento for external applications, so stay tuned. In the previous video, you saw how to create shell scripts in Magento to leverage a command line interface and interact with your Magento application. However, in this video, I'm going to show you how you can bootstrap Magento to run in any type of PHP script. So let's get started. You can see that I have another project in tandem with my Magento application now. So in my other project folder, I'm writing some type of report. And this report, for instance, is something that's going to be run ad hoc. Maybe it's a request that came in from my accounting department, and they needed me to build a really quick report to just see all of the order information. And all I want to know is who's ordering and what their grand total for the order is. So I can return that information pretty easy using procedural PHP scripting. I'm just going to iterate over a collection of orders and print out comma-separated values, essentially. So in order to get this kind of information, I could have written a basic SQL query. This example is very simple. However, there's a lot of functionality of Magento that if you wanted to report against that or write any type of procedural script against that, you would probably pull your hair out writing, countless join queries just to do something seemingly simple using the Magento object-oriented methods that they provide for you. So in order to gain access to standard Magento classes and all the object-oriented goodness that Magento provides out of the box, we need to do something that I call bootstrapping Magento into our own external script. So that's where all the code above line 5 comes in. So we're requiring a new file I created called bootstrap.php, and then we can initialize our app in a couple of different ways. So let me first show you how bootstrap.php works. So this is a new file that I created in my Magento root folder, and bootstrap.php is inspired by, the goings-on in index.php. So if you pull them up alongside, you can see index.php is doing all of what bootstrap.php is doing and then some. So in index, we're including the proper Magento base files, and making sure things exist, and if they don't exist, pushing you through the installation process. So I trimmed out a couple of those things in the bootstrap file to make it simpler. So all bootstrap is doing is finding the necessary Magento includes, pulling them in, requiring the core file system, setting developer mode, and then initializing the app. So it's not doing anything with routing, it's not running the store front end, it's just doing pretty much the bare minimum to get access to the Magento code base. There's a couple other files in the top level of the Magento root that are doing similar things. cron.php is setting up bare minimum code base so that you can run scheduled events. and get.php is doing something with static files. So there's a couple other examples out of the box in Magento that you can take a peek at to kind of glean the inner workings of how Magento bootstraps itself. But our bootstrap.php file is essentially a bare bones approach at getting access to the Magento codebase. So you can see that on line 55 at the end of my bootstrap process, I'm initializing the app. And that app function is declared in the mage.php file. This is like the main include point for Magento. And that app function here, you can pass it a code. By default, it's going to use your default store. So in our multi-site store environment, it's going to take whatever the default is. And then it initializes things. So if we're calling Mage app here, we're going to be loading our default store. In our report, however, say we wanted to just go with the admin, I would say mage init admin. And I have this line of echo code here to show you how this works. When I run my report, you can see I've already run it a few times. It tells me what store I'm in. I'm in the admin. So that's cool. I can actually load different stores. So if I didn't want the admin, if I wanted just a single store, I could say whatever store this is. I'll probably get an error or something because store X doesn't exist. Right, and I got some kind of error. But if I use the default store, I'm going to get my list of orders from that default store. So hopefully this makes sense for you. This is actually a quickly access information, integrate, and possibly change the behavior of a Magento installation. So let's recap. First, we took a look at how Magento loads itself in its own index.php and cron.php file. Then we wrote our own bootstrap.php file in the Magento root, which loads the bare bones of a Magento application. Finally, in order to load Magento in our external script, we need to include our bootstrap file and then make a call to the mage init function. This is going to give us access to our store. Coming up in the next video, I'll be showing you another advanced technique that you can use to debug Magento with the PHP extension called Xdebug. So stay tuned. Oftentimes when you're developing custom Magento extensions, you're going to run into issues and have to troubleshoot some code. If you follow along with some earlier videos, we'll have already set up the Magento logging and tweak some of the backend configuration to make our development lives a little easier. But in this video, I'm going to show you another advanced technique you can use. We'll be setting up the Xdebug third-party extension for PHP and integrating it with our IDE so that we can step through line by line and really investigate our code. So let's get started. First off, the Xdebug extension for PHP is a generic third-party extension that's not Magento specific. So you can use this process for any type of PHP project you're working on, not just Magento. So this comes in two phases. First, we need to install the Xdebug extension on our PHP server. Then we're going to have to configure our IDE to integrate with Xdebug and make our lives a whole lot simpler. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal, and we're going to have to install Xdebug to our server. So you can see I've already installed my Xdebug extension from the Ubuntu app repositories. If you followed along with our earlier installation procedure, you'll have installed Nginx and PHP FPM as our backend. The issue with running PHP FPM and the stock configuration is that PHP FPM listens on port 9000, which is also the port that Xdebug defaults to. So I can prove this to you by showing you all the listening ports. So you can see port 9000, PHP is listening on. So I need to edit my Xdebug config, which lives in etc php5 conf.d xdebug.ini. And that's specific to Ubuntu installations. If you're running a different Linux flavor, you might have to look around for that proper config file. And worst case scenario, you just plop it right into your core php.ini file. So if you just installed your Xdebug extension, all you should have in here is the line that's loading that extension. I've added a couple of lines here enabling remote debugging and just incrementing the port one digit so that it's not conflicting with PHP FPM. So a quick side note about remote debugging is that, for instance, if your server were deployed remotely, say it's in a staging environment, it's in the cloud somewhere, you can enable remote debugging, which is going to tell the server, essentially, it's safe to communicate with a remote debugger. So if you're a developer, you're working locally on your laptop or something, that's remote compared to the server where the code is actually deployed. And you would want to use Xdebug in this way and, for instance, tell Xdebug that your remote host is, whatever your laptop's IP is. Since we're doing this all locally, for now, I can leave this blank. Xdebug is going to default choose a local IP address as the remote host. Alright, so I save that, and now, since I'm running PHP FPM, I need to restart that service. If you are running something like mod PHP in Apache, you would just need to restart Apache. Oops, restart. So I don't have to restart Nginx because Nginx proxies things through FPM. Alright, so now you can verify that Xdebug is installed properly using PHP info page or something like that, but I'm just going to trust that I did it right this time. And we can move on to our IDE. So let's recap. Xdebug is a PHP extension that is installed from our Linux server's software repositories. After installing the extension, we had to configure it in the php.ini file and fix the port conflict that it has with PHP FPM's port 9000 by default. Once our configurations were complete, we had to restart our PHP FPM process in order for those configuration changes to take effect on the server. Coming up next, we'll continue setting up our Xdebug environment, so stay tuned. So in Sublime Text, if you followed along with the earlier videos, you'll have installed the package control. So the package control allows us to access our quick menu through Control-Shift-P, and if you start typing install, package control provides an installation utility. So we can install any type of package, and the one we want to install is the Xdebug interface for Sublime Text 2. So once our Xdebug package is successfully installed, we need to now configure it. So, like I said, the default port was 9000. We changed that. We're going to need to set that up. So, first things first, let's go ahead and get some settings overridden. And let's see, Xdebug doesn't have a quick menu for settings yet, so we're going to have to go through the package files just through our file system and move them to the right location. So the package folder for Xdebug has a settings file in it, and we could change this, but what I'm going to do is open it up and save it to my user folder so that this is a user configuration override. So I want it to go into my Sublime Text packages user, and I want it to use that Xdebug Sublime settings name. Alright, all I want to do is change the port. So that's pretty simple. Alright. So I seem to recall another caveat with the Xdebug plugin. Discovering packages will take us to the search page. I'm just trying to track down the landing page for the Xdebug extension, and I know it's hosted on GitHub. Here it is. So there's a little gotcha, and it's documented on the landing page for this plugin, and it's all the way down at the bottom. Here's some tips for getting things set up properly. and it has to do with these errors that you get in later versions of Ubuntu. So we're going to need to, essentially what it's telling us to do here is download the Python 2.6 archive package directly so that we can export those files into Sublime's local library so we can load any of the Python 2.6 dependencies, which later versions of Ubuntu beyond version 12.04 don't support in the repositories. So I'll click through the screens that I went through to get this file since it's buried a little bit. So the link says to download them from the Ubuntu archives, and you'll see a landing page for Python 2.6. You want to click on your appropriate architecture, 64-bit versus 32-bit. And then once on this page, we can download the file from the link about in the middle of the page. All right, so I'm going to copy that link address and just wget that link. All right, then we can use a utility in Ubuntu that the Xdebug package is referencing called dpkg-deb, and this will simply extract the files from that package without installing it. It's essentially like untarring it. And do I need to specify a folder? Yeah, I should specify a destination. So this is kind of like a temporary extraction. But once it's extracted, you should see essentially a whole folder structure. And this is basically what the Ubuntu system would install to your operating system. So all we need to do is copy userlib Python 2.6 folder, which has a bunch of dependencies and libraries. We need to copy that cursively, Python 2.6, copy that to user lib sublime text2, and sublime text2 has its own local lib folder, and actually we just want to put it in that folder. So I'm going to have to sudo this because it's in a protected folder, and that looks good. Alright, so let me just double check. We should have user lib sublime text2 lib and the Python 2.6 folder. Okay, so that should be good. We can clear our console, and let's restart Sublime just to be safe. So quit, open. Okay. Hopefully we won't get any errors when we try to debug our site. So we've got our port set up, we've got that hidden dependency taken care of, and we should be able to start debugging our site. So let's recap. Installing the Sublime Xdebug plugin is simple. However, there was another step we had to take in order to fix a dependency issue on recent versions of Ubuntu. In the next video, we'll continue demonstrating how you can debug your Magento applications with Xdebug, so stay tuned. We've got our port set up, we've got that hidden dependency taken care of, and we should be able to start debugging our site. So the way this plugin works with your IDE is you'll set breakpoints on different lines, and that will force the script to pause and wait for you to interact with it. And alright, so the menu to bring up the Xdebug control panel is Shift F8. You can add, remove breakpoints. You can also hotkey that. The hotkey is Control F8, and that toggles it. So once we have a breakpoint set, we should be able to debug this page by simply loading it in the browser. So we can close these old pages. And if you dug through the Xdebug documentation, you'll know that there's a secret URL parameter you can pass called Xdebug session start, and you give it the IDE key. For Sublime, that's sublime.xdebug. So when I run this, just to give you a little background, Xdebug is going to set a cookie, so anytime I go to the page, it's going to be attempting to debug the page as long as I have my debugger listening. So we've got our breakpoints, we've got our browser set up. We need to not set a new breakpoint, but Shift F8 and start debugging. So now I see a couple screens popped up, and Xdebug is telling us we don't have a URL specified. Basically, if we did, it would automatically load our browser. But we're doing this a little manual, and we're going to just reload the page, and we'll see now that we're listening with our debugger, the page is still spinning. It should have returned by now, but the debugger is causing it to wait for our input. And you can see now there's a little indicator that we're on line 40. If I Shift F8, you'll see my options have changed. I can check the status. It's telling me that we're breaking. And if I press just F8, not Shift F8, you'll see the menu for interacting with the debugger. So I can step over. That's going to take me to the next line of code. I can continue to step over until, let's set a new breakpoint here. So I can, see, I can run, and that should stop at my next breakpoint. And now I can step into, which is going to, see that mage run function? It's going to go into that, open the file that has that function declared, and start at the first line of that function. So now I can step through that. So you can see this gives you really fine control over what's going on in your system. I was debugging a CMS page, and so the CMS index controller, and so if I put a breakpoint here and then I run, I should get back to that point and it should break. So you can see you can get really fine-grained controls over debugging your site. So let's recap. Since Xdebug functions as a client-server protocol, we need to first start the debugger client in our IDE. Next, we need to tell the server that it's going to be sending debug information to our client by adding the Xdebug session start value to the query string. Once these have been done, we can add breakpoints in our code so that we can step through line by line and troubleshoot our program.